Hey guys, I'm Urizi. This story is all about what if Naruto was born before the Nine Tails attacked. Really, how much can small things affect the world? Little things like the color of someone's hair? Their mentor? Maybe, their date of birth? Before we proceed with the story, please like and subscribe to this channel if you liked the video, and don't forget to check the description for the other works of the author if you liked the story. Let's start. Chapter 8, New Challengers. Naruto couldn't help the splitting grin that overcame his features as he stared around at the enormous crowd of people gathered. They were all here for him. Or, at least, that was how his slightly inflated head was thinking at the time. In truth, many of the people gathered in the enormous stadium had come to watch all the prospective Chunin fight. For many, it was the highlight of their year, for others it was a good time to relax or get some time off from work. Many would splurge their savings on the pot, the weeks leading up to the event filled with speculation on who would win. There were many nobles and high-ranking people of the elemental nation's political system interspersed with the crowd, many of their pockets lined with tickets. The fire daimyo was even present, sitting in a specifically constructed box for him and any of his invitees. They were here to see the new crop of talent so that they could get a better idea of the various villages' strengths for when it came time to hire shinobi. Finally there sat the Hokage up in his own platform, smiling down at the single Konoha team that had made it this far. 4 teams in total had made it to the final round, one from Tsunagakuer, another from Omegakuer and a third from Takigakuer. It had surprised many that the only major villages to make it to the finals had been Konoha and Suna, especially considering that teams from both Kiri and Kumo had entered. The news only made Hiruzen smile. He considered it a way to show that Konoha had not been weakened since the Kyuubi attack. Now all he needed was for the single leaf team to show off their abilities to reinforce that notion. A hush overcame the crowd as a single Jonin made his way into the main ground of the arena, smiling happily as if he was walking to his favorite restaurant, not about to initiate a fight. He stopped in front of the 4 assembled teams who had also stopped chatting amongst themselves. He smiled again, making Naruto think he seemed far too happy for the position he was in. It actually creeped him out just a little. From the way his friends' faces turned, they were thinking the same thing. Alright guys, time to show what your villages are made of. He got a few grins from the Ame team at that, which in turn only brightened his own smile. Now, contrary to past years, we felt that the number of people who made it through didn't quite warrant a preliminary round. However, there are still enough of you that one-on-one fights could take the majority of the day. Instead, so we don't bore our kind patrons and nobles, we'll be having team fights, 3-on-3. A few of the genin's eyebrows rose at this, while once again the Ame team grinned deviously. Alright, first up will be Konoha and Ame, then we'll have Suna against Taki before the winner of each match face off against one another. Remember, the fights will go on until I stop them or all the members of one team are unable to continue. Like the last round, killing is alright here, but only if necessary. No need to go and scare all the people who came to see you fight, right? He finished his semi-question with a sickeningly sweet smile that seemed all too genuine, another reason all the genin found themselves taking a step back from the man unconsciously. Alright, Konoha and Ame stay here, the other 2 teams will go to the competitor's box until this match is over. He grinned pleasantly again. Good luck guys and have fun. With nothing more he disappeared in a shunshin to the other side of the arena with his arm raised up. The 2 genin teams left in the arena looked at each other warily, taking in what they could of their opponent's abilities. You should have stayed in the academy, brats. I don't know how you made it this far, but you're no match for us. Naruto raised an eyebrow but smirked slightly as he turned away from the shouting genin, already having gathered what he could. The one who spoke seemed to be the pseudo-leader of the team, or at least, he was the brashest. He towered high for his age, dwarfing his 2 teammates with the muscles to match, clearly shown off with his ripped, sleeveless blue kimono. An umbrella was slung over his back. From the one encounter Team Ensui had with an Ame missing nin, they knew it was full to the brim with senbon. Other than that, he had no visible weapons. He could have more hidden away in his clothes, and it was likely he was armed to the teeth. Naruto remembered a time when they had to fight against an annoyingly agile kunoichi from Kiri who had a tendency to hide her weapons in surprising and embarrassing places. So much so that she had eventually managed to give them the slip. To this day, Naruto and his team hadn't told anybody about that particular encounter or risk a heavy blush. To the right of the leader was a much shorter girl who nonetheless carried the same smug air about her, the kind members of a powerful clan tended to hold. He was just lucky Shisui and Itachi weren't like that, or his time as a genin would have been near unbearable. She wore a flowing robe that, due to its impracticality in movement, probably made her a genjutsu type. Naruto couldn't help noticing though that beneath her rather haughty attitude she was rather beautiful with her flowing black hair and large green eyes. Finally the team was complemented by an average-looking boy to their leader's left. However, Naruto knew better than to assume somebody's abilities based purely on appearance. The way his fingers subtly twitched towards his many pockets led the redhead to believe he was eager to begin. His overall appearance gave Naruto the idea he was the up-close and personal type, further helped by the boxing tape wrapped around his hands and lower arms. Other than that there wasn't much to notice: slightly unruly brown hair, calculative black eyes and clothes that were obviously more for practicality than anything else. He noticed that the other team were sizing them up just as much as he was, and it made him wonder what they saw. He passed the thought over as he turned away, searching through the crowd until he spotted what he was looking for, Anko waving as she sat next to her sensei. The leader of the other team seemed so irritated by the redhead's lack of attention towards his opponents, that he began to draw a kunai out of his pouch. Luckily for him, at that very moment, the Jonin threw his hand down, initiating the match. As if a switch had been flipped in each of the three Konoha genin, they suddenly span around, each unleashing their own barrage of kunai. The move was so fast and synchronized the Ame genin had some difficulty dodging, or in the case of their leader bringing his umbrella around to bat the projectiles away. Naruto absently noticed that thanks to her bulky kimono the girl managed to get hit by a glancing kunai thrown by Shisui. Not willing to let up in their assault, the three took on a well-rehearsed and battle-honed tactic, with Shisui and Naruto rushing forwards as Itachi stayed back, continuing to offer support with the occasional barrage of kunai. As they ran, Naruto felt the trace amount of his opponent's chakra try to invade his mind in an attempt to put him under a genjutsu. He scoffed at the attempt, knowing that Itachi would be insulted if he didn't manage to break out of such a weak technique. Even as he thought this, a few chains seemed to break out of the earth, each with a pointed tip solely aimed at him. Before the phantom implements could even get close, he suddenly disrupted his entire chakra system before flaring it back, stronger than ever. Instantly, the illusion was broken, surprising the girl who had attempted to cast it. In her surprise she found it difficult to react, as Naruto closed the distance between them so hastily he seemed to vanish in a shunshin. Flickering back into existence right of her, he lashed out with a strong kick meant to hit her in the stomach. She blocked with both of her bony arms, once again surprised by the ferocity and power behind the blow that forced her back a little. However, what she really didn't expect was for Naruto to suddenly twist his body, using the leverage he already had on her body to raise his other foot and deliver a powerful scissor kick to her back. The girl cried out in pain, obviously not used to fighting up close like this. It was painfully apparent she had become overly reliant on her teammates. In a surprising move, she managed to spin her body around, catching Naruto off guard for just a moment. However, she missed her opportunity to capitalize on that instability. Naruto grounded his feet and disappeared in a burst of speed again. The girl just glanced around fearfully, trying to predict where Naruto would appear next without success. The last thing she saw was the second shadow merged with her own in front of her before a swift chop had her knocked out on the ground. Naruto sighed at the lack of fight the girl had put up, expecting more from his first real fight with people his own rank apart from his teammates. He glanced around to check on his friends, noting that Shisui was currently engaged in a hectic taijutsu match with their leader, while Itachi had already managed to subdue his opponent with a subtle genjutsu that had the boy believing he was fighting an army of undead. Content to allow his teammate to finish on his own, Naruto settled for tying up the girl as he watched Shisui fight from the corner of his eye. The Uchiha grinned as he ducked under another fast and powerful low, his Sharingan easily predicting the next movement, allowing him to subtly divert the next punch away from himself. Taking advantage of that and unintentionally borrowing a move from Naruto, he kept a hold of the loose arm as he spun around, lashing out with his fist at the last moment to catch the large genin in the side of the head. The Ame shinobi seemed dazed by the blow, but otherwise unhurt, made clear as he rushed back into the conflict. This time, he had brought out his umbrella, using the reinforced implement as a makeshift sword with surprising skill. It was enough to keep Shisui on the defensive and far enough away that he couldn't engage with taijutsu again. Naruto was about to go in and help his teammate before the Uchiha jumped backwards, hurriedly running through hand signs before finishing on Tiger. Fire release, Great Fireball Jutsu. To the Ame shinobi and spectators' surprise, an enormous ball of pure flames erupted from Shisui's mouth. It was massive, even for some watching Jonin, a truly impressive jutsu for one so young, even if he was an Uchiha. The single remaining Ame genin tried to appear unfazed as he opened out his umbrella. When the sphere of heat finally dissipated, the boy was standing in an enormous crater. His umbrella was slightly singed, his body sweating from the incredible burst of heat, but otherwise he was undamaged. Wow, pretty pathetic fireball if it couldn't even touch me. Now let me show you why I was the Rookie of the Year in Ame. The boy suddenly threw his umbrella high up into the air before jumping up and grabbing a hold of it again. Ninja art, rain blood drops. He began to spin furiously, looking like a small tornado as he continued to spin in the air, held aloft by the umbrella. Out of nowhere senbon began to rain down from him in numbers that seemed unlikely from such a small umbrella. Soon enough the entire arena was completely covered in the deadly metal implements, and as he landed, a little winded from the attack, he huffed. The arena was in complete silence as everybody looked at the 5 bodies lying on the floor. Even the other 2 Ame ninja hadn't been spared from the slaughter, they just lay there, bleeding slowly. Finally the last standing ninja grinned victoriously, a smile that was wiped from his face as all 5 bodies puffed out of existence. To his surprise, the Konoha team suddenly rose from the ground like it was water, suddenly very thankful, and Sui had seen fit to teach them the earth release, hiding like a mole technique. Naruto had the girl he was fighting slung over one shoulder while Itachi had his opponent in a similar position under his arm. You know, people like you, people who abandon their teammates, they're worse than trash. The Ame ninja was too tired to hide his annoyance at their survival as he huffed in apparent indignation. If they were weak enough to lose to brats like you, then they didn't deserve to live. Both Naruto and Shisui's eyes twitched dangerously while Itachi even seemed slightly riled by the comment. Before anybody else could react, Shisui vanished in a technique very well known to the Jonin in the crowd. Nobody was left unsurprised as he reappeared in a similar flicker of movement behind the Ame genin, crouched down in a ready stance. The other shinobi could only widen his eyes before he was launched into the air by a particularly vicious kick. He was rightfully frightened when Shisui flickered into existence above him, his leg raised and a snarl on his face. He brought it down in one fast kick that sent the unfortunate genin into the ground, a huge plume of smoke and debris following his impact. When it finally cleared, it revealed a very much unconscious and badly hurt Ame genin laying in a crater double his own height in diameter. After the stunned silence in the audience lasted for a few seconds, a single clapping jonin soon turned onto an enormous round of applause for the entire Konoha team. Naruto just smiled happily even as the unconscious girl on his shoulder groaned, waking up from her forceful departure into the land of sleep. The 3 genin, each now carrying their own unconscious passenger, quickly made their exit to the competitor box to let the other teams fight. Naruto set his charge down against the wall as his teammates followed suit, only paying slight mind to the fight going on in the arena between the Suna shinobi and the Taki ninja. So, how do you think we did? Naruto just grinned at Shisui as the gesture was returned in kind. I caught a glimpse of a few nobles as we left the arena, they looked pretty impressed. Shisui just smiled to himself at that, happy he managed to leave an impact on the judges. Itachi however seemed more thoughtful, his attention on the fight at hand as he tried to take in their potential opponent's abilities to prepare against them. As far as he could tell, the Suna shinobi seemed to be using mainly earth techniques to subdue their opponents, one even was attempting to use some rather weak wind techniques. The Taki shinobi however seemed to use solely water techniques, as befitting of the village they hailed from. We shouldn't let the victory go to our heads, we still have other opponents to face before this is over. Naruto just sighed with a small smile on his face, looping an arm over his teammate's shoulders. Come on Itachi, just enjoy the victory for once. If we can face a ranked missing nin, then a few genin shouldn't be trouble. Itachi sighed with his eyes closed. Sometimes, his friends were a bit too overconfident for their own good. Just don't underestimate our opponents. Naruto gave a conceding nod with a quirk of his lips as the 3 turned back to the arena, only to find that the match was already over. Shisui's eyebrows shot up in surprise at the speed the match was fought at. Did anybody catch what happened? He didn't see the two confused shakes his friends gave in the negative, his eyes glued on the scene. The Suna shinobi lay on the ground, one completely unconscious while the other two were rolling on the ground, their eyes screwed shut in pain. Itachi narrowed his eyes, trying to examine what he could from the scene but drawing a blank. It looked like the effects of a flash bomb but more severe, and nobody in the audience seemed affected. Intriguing. Naruto had similar thoughts as he gazed down at the arena, watching with a critical eye as the Suna team was carried off. Finally, they were called up and each vanished, reappearing in the center of the arena in their own unique way. They found that arriving in two flashes of speed and a flock of crows had the tendency to put their opponents off. It seemed ineffective against the Taki shinobi, but Naruto at least took that time to examine them. The one standing in the center reminded him of the other leader of the last group they fought. He was tall with broad shoulders and the muscles that spoke of a lot of intense training. However, he differed from the other boy as his face held none of that same arrogance. To the contrary, he seemed quite kind and pleasant. He had a dull, dirty blonde mop of hair that almost hid his light green eyes. He wore a dark green shirt with a darker brown coat slung over the top, while his forehead protector was displayed in a similar way to Naruto's own. To his left and right stood two girls, one his age and one that seemed much younger. The first had a shock of white hair that stretched down her back with two long bangs that framed the sides of her face and complemented her shining blue eyes. She wore a light blue dress that seemed deceptively restricting for her line of work, as well as two boot-like sandals. The sleeves of her dress fanned out at her wrists, covering her hands and keeping whatever she was holding hidden. The last girl was the most intriguing, with green hair and the most startling pair of orange eyes he had ever seen. However, the more surprising thing was that she seemed even younger than him, possibly up to 2 years younger. In comparison to her teammates, she seemed rather shy, as if she didn't feel she belonged with them. Naruto also managed to catch that every time either of her teammates would look at her, it would be with either a dense glare or face-wrinkling anxiety. She looked up and for a brief instant their eyes met. Just looking into her incredible orange eyes, he saw loneliness and pain, the likes of which a girl her age shouldn't have experienced. Was she trying to evoke his sympathy? He wouldn't relax around a strange team like Taki's now. Before he could dwell on it, the match was started. This time, instead of rushing in like they had before, the team decided to remain back and let their opponents come to them. Just as they hoped, the two older teammates rushed forward, both running through simultaneous hand signs before holding out their hands. Water release, water cutting sword. Instantly water coalesced from the surrounding moisture into two long swords made entirely out of water. Taken by surprise, Shisui had to jump back from their attack, having nothing he could use to defend against the larger boy. Itachi managed to jump in before his friend wound up in a difficult situation, his tanto already in hand. Naruto, on the other hand, was grinning as he finally got an opportunity to test a technique he had been steadily working on recently. Running through his own hand signs, he extended his hand in a similar manner to the Taki shinobi. Wind release, blade of wind. An almost invisible blade materialized in Naruto's hand, flickering slightly as he fought to stabilize his chakra in the technique. Luckily, his practice with the Rasengan greatly improved his control over the difficult shape manipulation technique. Unfortunately, he could still only hold it for a minute at maximum. He met the slash from the older female member of the team, the surprise evident on her face when he parried her attack with seemingly nothing. That surprise seemed to carry over as his blade just seemed to melt through her own, forcing her to jump back or be slashed across the chest. She looked at Naruto warily, trying to distinguish his blade from the surrounding air, while Naruto tried not to show how difficult maintaining his technique was. Knowing he was running out of time, the redhead shot forward with his weapon extended. The Taki Kunoichi tried to block, but once again his own blade just phased right through her own, this time managing to nick her on the arm before she dodged away. Finally, Naruto released the jutsu, finding it too difficult to maintain his chakra flow any longer. In the brief lull, he sent a glance to see how his friends were doing, while the Kunoichi was making sure he still didn't have his wind blade. Itachi was currently in a fierce kenjutsu fight, finding it difficult due to the water-cutting sword's ability to simply pass through his own. He was having to use the flat of his tanto to divert the blade instead of blocking it directly, which forced him to adapt his still rather fresh sword style. Luckily his Sharingan's predictive abilities kept him at his much more skilled opponent's level. Even now he was subtly weaving a complicated genjutsu to keep the man occupied. Shisui on the other hand had taken advantage of the fact the last member of the opposing team seemed to just be holding back, doing nothing. However, while he rushed at her with harsh and brutal, yet swift and precise attacks, she dodged every one. Her movements weren't particularly fast, but she had a strange airy grace as she seemed to almost dance around his blows. What made it worse for the Uchiha was that she wasn't even trying to counter-attack, so his Sharingan became less helpful. Returning to his own fight, he frantically moved to the left just as the Kunoichi thrust at him with her sword, barely dodging the attack before he sent 3 very swift punches along her arm. They weren't particularly damaging, but they were enough to disrupt her concentration and force her to abandon the technique. Now swordless, she was put on the defensive as Naruto came at her in a blur of red, moving much faster than her body could react. He was admittedly holding back, but he didn't want to seriously hurt the girl, just incapacitate her. Unfortunately, that gave her the opportunity to pull out a kunai. Getting close to her with pure taijutsu was now going to be much more problematic. He sighed as he pulled out a kunai of his own, drawing gasps from the few shinobi present who knew what the unique design meant. Of course, he didn't know the Hiraishin as his skills with seals weren't anywhere close to his father's level, but he used the kunai anyway to get a feel for them when that time came. He re-engaged the Kunoichi, deflecting or blocking her attacks but never offering any of his own above a simple scratch along the arm or a nick on the chest. Finally he grew slightly tired of the fight and disappeared in a blur of red again. This time, he just appeared behind her, lashing out with a curt kick to the back of her head. To his surprise, the girl in front of him simply melted into a puddle of water, the Kunoichi having apparently substituted herself as soon as he disappeared. She smiled victoriously as she appeared behind him, stabbing him in the side with her kunai. To her even greater surprise, the redhead in front of her also disappeared, but in a cloud of smoke. She was too surprised to defend the blow to the back of her head, dropping to the ground without any more fight. Naruto looked around again to check on his teammates only to find Itachi had subdued his in the same manner as before, while Shisui appeared to almost be dancing with his opponent. The Kunoichi he was fighting finally noticed that both her teammates had been defeated and jumped back, looking between the 3 of them fearfully. "Please, I don't want to hurt you." Shisui just scoffed in irritation as he attempted to close the distance between them with a shunshin. The mint-haired girl surprised him though when he appeared behind her. He was suddenly blown back by an unseen force while Naruto and Itachi looked on in amazement. Protruding from the girl's back were a set of insect-like wings that left many in the audience, save those from Takigaku, in awe and silence. With one quick flap she had sent Shisui flying back from the gust of wind she created. "I'm sorry about this." She started to fly up into the air, keeping her audience and her opponents amazed that she could actually fly. Hiding in scale powder jutsu. Suddenly the girl exhaled an enormous mass of fine powder particles into the air, even as the 3 Konoha genin looked on in wonder. Suddenly all the particles seemed to glow before they caught the light, blinding all 3 shinobi in the arena yet somehow leaving the audience unaffected. Both Itachi and Shisui fell to the ground in pain, their sensitive jujutsu being overloaded by all the light. Naruto winced in pain as he closed his eyes, but didn't fall. Instead he focused on his ears, trying to find the Kunoichi through his other sense. For her part the girl seemed surprised that Naruto could still stand and immediately targeted him first. However, to her even greater surprise, as soon as she flapped her wings once his head snapped around in her direction at the same moment his arm did. 3 of his kunai immediately shot from his extended hand with perfect accuracy. Everybody in the audience was left astounded as they looked on at the Taki Kunoichi pinned to the arena wall with a kunai in each wing and one protruding from her thigh. When Naruto's vision finally returned he saw the proctor call the match, but not before the arena had once again erupted into a massive round of applause. He helped Shisui to his feet before doing the same with Itachi, both heavily disoriented by their temporary loss of vision. They looked around themselves, or at least the 2 Uchiha appeared to. In fact they still couldn't see properly. The crowds were in an uproar of cheering, praising their performance to the highest degree. The 3 of them just soaked it in with grins, even Itachi was smiling lightly. Naruto ran down the corridor of the arena, calling for the Taki shinobi to wait. The 3 young genin just looked around in confusion before spotting the approaching redhead. The min-haired girl, who was in the best condition despite her limp, turned to see what he wanted while her teammates just continued on. Naruto stopped in front of her, smiling slightly despite her outwardly cautious appearance. "Hi, I'm Naruto." He extended his arm out even as the girl just looked at it with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. After a few moments Naruto just chuckled, looking between the two of them. You're supposed to shake it." The min-haired girl's eye narrowed, but she took his offered hand anyway, shaking it only once before pulling back. "Don't have much experience with people, do you?" He chuckled again, only meaning it jokingly, but immediately the girl's head lowered. The sadness was evident in her eyes despite her attempts to hide it. Sorry about that." The girl just shook her head as she extended her own hand. This time when Naruto took it she shook for slightly longer and even managed a weak smile. "No problem, it's Fia by the way." Naruto just smiled before Fia finally took her hand away. "So what did you want, Naruto?" The redhead suddenly became slightly more serious, shocking the Taki Kunoichi with how quickly he changed his emotions. "I couldn't help but notice, back when you used that wing technique, your chakra it was, well." He struggled for the words, knowing it would probably be a touchy subject for the girl if her reaction to the handshake was anything to go on. "You're a Jinchuriki, aren't you?" Fu immediately took a step back, her eyes narrowed and posture defensive. "Why? What does it matter to you?" Her tone said it all. Any trust he had managed to garner in their brief exchange was gone, replaced by cautiousness and distrust. Quickly, Naruto waved a dismissive hand as he pulled up his fishnet shirt, channeling chakra so that his seal became visible. Fu just stared at it in recognizable shock before looking back up to his sheepishly smiling face. "You Yuri won too?" Naruto just nodded slightly grimly but managed to keep a small smile on his features. "I just wanted to check on you, we have to stick together, right?" Fu just nodded dumbly before blinking herself out of the slight stupor that overcame her. I have to catch up to my friends, but, if you're ever in Taki I guess." Naruto just nodded in understanding, his smile growing slightly. "Likewise." Fu managed to broaden her smile ever so slightly before she turned around to walk off, taking one last look over her shoulder at Naruto before jogging off to catch up to her team. Naruto watched her leave before sighing. He probably could have handled that better, but it turned out alright in the end. He had been sincere when he told Fu he only wanted to check on her. He hadn't simply sat idle since finding out what he held within him. He had researched Jinchuriki and what he found had not been encouraging. Most were used as weapons while others were driven insane by their tenants. It was generally not a pleasant existence, especially considering many Jinchuriki were seen as the biju they contained and hated for it. Luckily for Naruto, it had been his father's wish that he be treated as a hero for what he contained. While it didn't quite extend that far, most didn't look at him any differently for what he held. He guessed it helped that he wasn't a baby when it was sealed, or the people would have nothing to compare his behavior to. "Hey! There you are, Naruto." He turned only to get tackled by a flying hug from a purple blur. "Oh, hey Anko," he said in a pleased murmur. She sat on his chest, straddling him with a grin as she poked him in the forehead. "That was pretty impressive, Mr. Chunin." Naruto just chuckled, accepting that fact that Anko probably wasn't going to get off of him anytime soon. "Anko, you know that just because we won we aren't necessarily going to be made Chunin." Anko just scoffed with a playful smirk. "As if. After that performance, how couldn't you get promoted?" Naruto conceded a small smile before poking the straddling girl in the stomach. "Just remember that'll be you next year." He was briefly saddened when he remembered the training trip Anko was about to leave on, but he covered it well. She finally let him up and the two began to make their way out of the arena corridor to find Naruto's team and go celebrate their victory. However, as soon as they did, an Umbu operative dropped from the shadows, startling both of them. "Naruto Namikaze, a message from Lord Danzo." The redhead Jut looked at the scroll the masked shinobi offered before taking it, allowing the Umbu to once again disappear into the shadows. "Danzo? The guy who's in charge of Umbu? What does he want with me?" Anko just shrugged as the two continued on, with Naruto's eyebrows disappearing further and further into his hairline the more of the scroll he read. Chapter 9, New Journeys. "You asked to see us, Hokage-sama." Hiruzen smiled as the three genin walked into the room, all noting that their sensei was present as well. Yes, Naruto, I called you here to talk about your performance in the Chunin exams. Immediately a gleam of anticipation appeared in Shisui's eyes. Naruto likewise felt excited, but hid it better to maintain his dignified exterior. While Itachi continued to be Itachi, his face stony and stoic, eyes staring ahead like a specter. Naruto wondered if he was always lost in his thought or just completely mindless. All three straightened up slightly, already half knowing what this was about now and none of them feeling any less honored. Our performances. He said it with a straight face, but it was all Shisui could do to stop himself bouncing around in joy. The Hokage for his part simply smiled kindly. He always enjoyed this moment and it was never any different. After your outstanding participation in the Chunin exam finals as well as exemplary instances of both teamwork and individual cunning, I'm proud to award you all the rank of Chunin. As he said it, he pulled out 3 standard Chunin flak jackets from a drawer, handing them to Ansui who, in turn, passed them on to the 3 smiling genin. I can only say I'm proud of each and every one of you. Now go and serve your village in your new roles. All 3 newly promoted Chunin gave a quick and very much happy nod before being ushered out of the office. Hiruzen smiled warmly as he leaned back in his large chair, confident in the knowledge he made the right decision to promote those 3. Hiruzen thought excitedly, Naruto, you are already well on your way to surpassing your father. However, that idea made the aging Hokage sink as he swiveled in his chair. The stoic faces of the past Hokage stared back at him through the open window, their grim looks mirroring his own. Minato, it should have been you standing here giving your son that flak jacket. He thought of Minato's own rise through the ranks, Jiraiya standing beside him, and it made his nostalgic heart clench. He sighed slowly before returning to the large stack of paperwork that always appeared around the Chunin exams, the emptiness of the office doing little to quiet the twisting in his stomach. The looks of glee on each of the boys' faces could be likened to that of a child receiving the present they had been waiting for all year. Itachi was the only one who managed to maintain somewhat of an air of composure while his 2 slightly more open teammates were just barely restraining themselves from bouncing off the walls. Yes. I can't believe we did it. Naruto just grinned with equal fervor as he looped an arm around his friend's shoulders. Please. Like there was ever any doubt, we are the best genin team after all. Itachi even chuckled at that, but only just a little, his lips parting as he said at last, with total, cold confidence, we were the best genin team. When his friends only looked at him strangely, obviously waiting for an explanation, he simply lifted up his recently acquired jacket as well as a single eyebrow. Both Naruto and Shisui broke out into enormous grins before being lightly smacked around the back of their heads by their sensei. Hey! Ensui-sensei, what's the big idea? The elder Nara simply sighed in exasperation at Shisui's antics before slowly walking off down the hallway. Don't get too ahead of yourselves, you're only Chunin. Both Shisui and Naruto managed to snort at that, still keeping their smirks up. As if anything could get me down today. Now come on Naruto, Itachi, it's not every day you make Chunin, we need to go out and celebrate. His redhead friend nodded quickly as both looked towards Itachi expectantly. The most calm and level-headed of the group merely sighed before looking up with the barest hints of a smirk. I guess a few drinks would be alright. He instantly regretted that comment as Shisui fist-pumped the air before grabbing both of his friend's hands and disappearing in a large swirl of leaves. When they all reappeared next to the dango hut they often frequented with Anko, both Naruto and Itachi nearly keeled over. Damn it Shisui! What I told you about taking us along on your shunshuns? Shisui just grinned sheepishly as he rubbed the back of his head, he was still too happy to particularly care though. I'm going to have a lot of fun getting back at you for that when I get the hydration down. Naruto's lips curled at the corners, evilly smirking at his Uchiha friend as he struggled to right himself after the disorienting experience. To this day, he had unpleasant memories of when his father would take him through his famed technique. While his body adjusted eventually, the first few times were still nerve-wracking. Humans just weren't meant to move at those kinds of speeds naturally. Come on, I'm sure it can't be that bad. Shisui couldn't understand his friend's positions. He suffered absolutely no ill effects when he used his favorite jutsu. However, the 2 equally hard glares he got from his teammates told him otherwise. Anyway, come on, first drinks are on me then. Sweat dripped from his temple at how quickly his friends recovered after that, making him briefly wonder if he just got swindled. He wasn't given much time to ponder it before he was pulled into the dango hut by both arms. A few minutes later and the three of them were sat down around a booth with a plate of steaming dango in the middle next to a jug of sake and a small bowl of red bean paste. The general atmosphere of the small restaurant and bar was light and jovial, another reason why the three former genin enjoyed visiting so often, that, and the fact that it was practically Anko's second home. All three of them were eyeing their new flak jackets with grins, or in Itachi's case, a small smirk. Man, this is so cool. I've been waiting way too long to get this jacket. Even as the self-proclaimed Shunshin expert said that he was slipping on said symbol of his new rank. Naruto just nodded slowly, even as a small frown managed to work its way onto his features despite the happy occasion. Yeah, me too, but I don't know whether it's even worth putting it on. Both Uchiha just looked at their friend oddly before their own frowns found their way onto their faces. Oh, I guess you're right. Shisui couldn't believe his happy mod had been deflated so quickly. That's right, Umbu. Naruto and Shisui nodded at their friend's comment, their minds going back to when each received their own letter from the elite organization. What do you guys think it will be like in Umbu? Naruto looked thoughtful for a moment, as did Itachi, both seeming lost in their own thoughts about their future careers. Ka-san was in Umbu for a while but she had to stop when I was born. Itachi nodded quickly, putting his jacket to one side for now. Yes, she was on the same team as my mother. From what she tells me they generally handle the more covered missions for the village, more danger but much less recognition. However, generally shinobi tend not to do more than 5 years within the organization, most see it as unhealthy to go on for more. That put both of the stoic Uchiha's teammates into thought. I don't get it, we're only just Chunin, why are we getting this invitation now? Itachi sighed as he looked at his jacket again before turning his gaze over to his fellow clan member. You forget that Kakashi Hatake, the copy ninja, was in Umbu at around our age. Naruto perked up at the mention of one of his father's students. Yeah, but that was just after the war, and he was already a Jonin. Itachi just shrugged. In honesty, he knew just as much as his teammates, he was only trying to offer what insight he could. Shisui looked around at his friends, noting how the atmosphere had been effectively dampened in only a few minutes. Hey, come on guys, today was supposed to be a great day. I mean, come on, we're Chunin, this is the start of a new chapter in our careers and Umbu will be just the same. As long as we're a team, then we're unstoppable. Naruto smiled at that, feeling his confidence return quickly. Yeah, Umbu won't know what hit them. Itachi sighed with a small smile as he looked up at his friends. Well, we can all agree on that. With the mood effectively restored, they began to dig into their otherwise untouched plate of dango. Anyway, I bet I can make captain before Itachi can. The Sharingan wielder merely raised an eyebrow at his red-headed friend while covering up the small smirk that overcame his features. You do realize the previous captain has to resign or be incapacitated for a new one to be picked. Naruto just grinned happily between mouthfuls of the sweet dumplings. So you admit that you can't do it? This time Itachi couldn't hide the smirk as it slipped over his face. Never. The three Chunin emerged from the dango hut laughing, smiling, and just a little drunk. They were about to take off in their individual directions, namely home, before another leaf Chunin dropped down in front of them. Almost instantly sobering, they watched as the Chunin took out a small scroll from his pocket and handed it to Shisui before sprinting off again. His friends looked curiously over his shoulder as he read the message, watching as his face grew whiter by the second. Shisui, what's wrong? What does it say? He didn't get an answer as Shisui vanished in a large swirl of leaves, dropping the scroll on the ground. Naruto picked it up and quickly scanned its contents. With each passing line the frown on his face grew before a sad sigh escaped his lips. What does it say? Naruto turned to his other Uchiha friend before showing him the message. Like before, Itachi's usually impassive face quickly dissolved into a frown. The two Chunin immediately took off in the direction of the hospital. Both Naruto and Itachi waited anxiously outside the hospital room door. Naruto paced nervously while Itachi passed the time staring at the clock hanging in the corridor. They had already been waiting for 15 minutes for Shisui to re-emerge from the room. Finally the door opened slowly and a pale Shisui walked out with unsteady feet. Immediately Itachi was on his feet and Naruto was across the hallway, both looking to their friend with worry. "How is she?" Shisui looked up at them and both could see his bloodshot eyes, stained from recent tears. "The doctors are still running tests, they said when she wakes up they will have a better idea." He looked down again, fresh tears already beginning to leak from the corners of his eyes. "But they said it wasn't good, they said she probably won't last the night." Both Itachi and Naruto's eyes opened wide at that, unable to find the words to express their shock. Naruto settled for placing his arms around his friend's shoulders in a comforting manner while Itachi patted him once on the back, rather awkward in situations like these. "Is there anything we can do?" Shisui shook his head slowly, his breathing returning to normal from his panting sobs. "I'm going to stay here, see if she wakes up before." He trailed off, unable to finish the thought as his body was once again racked with sobs. Naruto was forced to support his friend as he nearly collapsed from the emotional stress. He looked up at Itachi and after receiving a nod from the other Uchiha they both led the quietly sobbing boy back inside the hospital room. The window was left slightly open and a light breeze drifted in, moving the curtains slightly in the wind. A woman with dark hair lay on the single hospital bed reserved for Uchiha patients when the need arose. Her face looked serene in her sleep but there were the unmistakable signs of exhaustion and her whole body spoke of her tiredness. Naruto had to admit that even he was rather shell-shocked by this whole affair and with his mother's passing and his befriending of Shisui, Nimue Uchiha had almost become a surrogate mother for him. Now he was looking down on her peaceful form as he led Shisui to the chair by her bedside. For all the world it looked like she was merely asleep, if he didn't know any better he might have believed she would wake up tomorrow like nothing was wrong. The signs had always been there, she was always tired when he would come around to their house, then again he attributed that to the stress of being a single mother. With Shisui's father passing away not long after his birth, Nimue was practically all the young Uchiha prodigy had as family. He still had his clan but nothing really compared to the love of a mother or the bond of a father, Naruto could certainly attest to that. If the doctors were right and the woman wasn't long for this world, then Shisui would lose his last shred of true family. He looked to his left and saw that Shisui had managed to drift off into a somewhat fitful sleep, the emotion of it all finally catching up to him. Naruto sighed quietly as he took the seat to Nimue's other side. He would keep watch all night if he had to in case the woman woke up. Shisui shouldn't have to miss his mother's last words. He sat there all night, just watching over their sleeping forms through half-lidded eyes, never moving an inch until sunlight finally streamed through the blinds. Itachi had long since gone home, probably to inform his family of what was going on. The passing of an Uchiha was a big affair in a clan like theirs. It seemed as though nothing would happen. That as the sun began to bleed through into the room, the woman would pass without a word, her breaths so shallow and irregular that it seemed like she was already dead. Naruto had to go to the bathroom as dawn came. He excused himself hurriedly, the door to the cramped room slipping open and shut quietly. It seemed Shisui's mother picked just that time to awaken. Her dim, dark eyes opened slightly, seeing her empty son by her bedside. She may have tried to smile just then, but a withered, pained look was all she produced. She swallowed dryly, her voice like a cracking hiss, "Shisui." Her son looked up at her with wide, spinning eyes. He was stressed enough to activate his Sharingan and Nimue felt the hint of pride swell in her belly. Her son was strong. So strong. She spoke those words to him, her vision swimming and fuzzy, but she clinged to her own strength, knowing she did not have much longer to live. "I want to give you a gift, Shisui." She breathed, "It's not a pretty gift, but I want to live on through my son." "Ka-chan." Shisui murmured pitifully, words failing him. "Forgive me," was all she said, as she lifted her hands, releasing the last of her chakra, trapping her son in a genjutsu. When Naruto returned, his body stiffened. He saw Shisui's face buried silently into the stomach of his mother, who was completely still, her eyes wide, her body stiff with the grip of death. Shisui's body tremored in agony, his entire body just as stiff as his mother's. 2 bloody tears dripped from his eyes. As Naruto turned to call for a doctor, they would all fail to miss the 3 Tomo and Shisui's Sharingan shifting into a new design resembling a thick 4-pronged shuriken, the boy collapsing onto the floor painfully, his body finally going slack. The three Chunin knelt in a line in a darkened chamber well below Konoha proper. The space was dry and airy but held the unmistakable air of a military installation. The corridors were very utilitarian and uninspired with their monotonous design and dull gray paint. In front of the trio stood a tall man wearing the dark coat common to most Umbu operatives. However, he was not wearing the standard mask. It allowed the sight of his bandaged right eye and the cross-shaped scar on his chin as well as his spiky black hair. "Do you know why you were chosen to be here?" Naruto looked up from his knelt position straight into the man's single visible eye, which looked back with a blank, emotionless expression. "To work in the shadows where even shinobi fear to tread." The man nodded once as his gaze turned to Itachi on Naruto's left. "And do you know why we must move in those shadows?" Itachi looked up as well, meeting the man's steeled gaze with an equally steadfast look. "So that we can protect our village from the dark by harnessing it ourselves." The man nodded once more as his gaze finally drifted across to Shisui to Naruto's right. "And at what cost would you protect your village by?" Shisui paused a moment before he too finally looked up, the three tomo of his eye spinning slowly in a cold gaze. "With our lives and souls." The man nodded for the last time with a small fleeting smile before he was handed 3 masks from another operative standing just to his left. "Then from this day, until you leave this organization, you are no longer Naruto Namikaze." The redhead stood up as he accepted the white porcelain mask he was handed and looked at the animal design emblazoned on its surface. "I am no longer Naruto Namikaze, I am Tora." He smiled as Naruto walked backwards a few paces. "You are no longer Itachi Uchiha." Itachi repeated the process as he too took his mask. "I am no longer Itachi Uchiha, I am Taka." The man nodded curtly as he finally turned to the last member of the trio. "And you are no longer Shisui Uchiha." Once again the young Uchiha hesitated before slowly rising to his feet and looking the man right in the eye. "I am no longer Shisui Uchiha, I am Tori." The man finally stood back as Shisui rejoined his teammates in their line again. "Excellent, then welcome to Umbu." The 3 now masked shinobi all bowed curtly even as the man began to walk from the small room. "Thank you, Lord Danzo." None of them saw the smirk on the man's lips as he slowly limped from the room, refusing to use his cane for an important ceremony like this. "The 9 tails Jinchuriki and 2 Uchiha prodigies, everything is just falling into my lap." When the man was finally out of the room, the 3 newly anointed Umbu operatives breathed a sigh of relief. Danzo had a way of making any room rather uncomfortable. Even as they relaxed, another Umbu dropped from the ceiling, seemingly having been there the whole time. "Yo!" The trio just stared at the dog-masked man for a moment blankly, not that you could tell from behind their new masks. He was taller than them, but he didn't appear that much older, maybe 4 or 5 years at most. His most defining feature, thanks to the mask covering his face, was the incredible mass of gravity-defying silver hair. "I'm Inu, your Umbu captain. From this point on you answer directly to me unless I say otherwise. My word is only superseded by that of the Hokage, got it?" After receiving a few nods from the latest recruits, he smiled lazily behind his mask, both of them. "Good, then let's see about setting you guys up with a mission, shall we?" Anko couldn't help but sigh as she walked out of the Leaf Village's main gate. She was finally going on her year-long trip with Orochimaru, yet Naruto hadn't turned up to see her off. It was really unlike her red-headed friend. She knew he was a lot busier now that he was in the Umbu Corp, but she still thought he would at least turn up, seeing as it was the last chance they had to see each other for a long time. Still, she was happy. After all, she now had the chance to properly learn from one of the Sunin. Not only that, but she was going to be able to see the elemental nations. She had been studying all she could so she wouldn't disappoint her sensei. The tall, long-haired man was currently standing next to her, looking rather impatient as he tapped his foot irritably. He had granted her 5 minutes for Naruto to show up, then they would be leaving. Soon enough, her time was up, and with a small sigh of exasperation she turned from the village and walked out the gates with her sensei. Luckily for her, she turned back to look at the village one last time, managing to catch a glimpse of a lone shinobi standing up on a rooftop. He was clad in the classic Umbu uniform of slate gray body armor and black underclothing, with his tiger-themed mask glinting in the sunlight. He waved once before vanishing in a burst of speed reminiscent of a red blur. The sight made Anko smile warmly as she turned back to the road ahead of her. "All right sensei, where to first?" Orochimaru just hissed happily at his prized student's enthusiasm as he looked out over the horizon. "I have some contacts in the land of rice. I must meet up with Anko-chan." The purple-haired girl simply nodded happily as the two shinobi walked away from their village. Naruto flew down a narrow corridor, ignoring the cracked and peeling wallpaper on the old and termite-ridden wooden walls. His feet made audible splashes as he sprinted across the water-covered floor behind his Hokage. To his left was a bird-masked Umbu operative he had never worked with before, but by the sword on his back and the many shuriken dotted around his person, he could tell he was a weapons specialist. Naruto wasn't sure how much that was going to help them here, but the Umbu were currently spread quite thin. His gaze flickered back to Hiruzen running in front of him. It was so rare nowadays to see the aging Hokage in his full battle dress. The old samurai-styled armor was still as freshly polished as the day Sarutobi had first worn it. The old man had lovingly cared for the reminder of past days as much as any ninja would their weapons. The fact he was wearing it at all was a testament to the importance and seriousness of their mission, especially considering who it concerned. They stopped in front of a mildew-covered door, he and the Umbu taking up flanking positions while the third took point. With a hand signal, the two masked shinobi burst through the door into the room while Hiruzen followed in a slow and deliberate walk. The room itself was lined in shelves holding jars that contained various viscera and other objects Naruto would have rather not thought about. At the front of the small room stood a tall pale man with long black hair in the standard garb of a Konoha Jonin. So I've been found out, have I? What a pity. Naruto's skin crawled at the man's voice. He had seen firsthand what he had done at his other bases across the Land of Fire. Orochimaru, explain yourself. What is the meaning of this? Naruto found his hand unconsciously flexing against the hilt of his tanto as he waited. And after I set all those booby traps to give me plenty of warning. Naruto nearly scoffed at that. The snake Sunin considered himself a master of seals, but the redhead was an Uzumaki. There was no comparison. Heh, I wasn't expecting you. I should have known. You could get past anything. The other Umbu operative in the room stepped forward, his hand clenched in obvious anger even though his voice remained level. A steady flow of people have gone missing from the village over the past month. Genin, Chunin, even Umbu Black Ops, all of them were last seen with you. Naruto clenched his fists again, his body ever so slightly trembling from rage, but he managed to hold back. Orochimaru just chuckled lightheartedly, as if he wasn't being called out for crimes against his village. Ah, now I'll have to kill you as well. The other operative gasped as Hiruzen's eyes narrowed in anger and betrayal. So you admit it? It is all you're doing, Orochimaru, but why? Orochimaru sighed in a bored way with that same smirk on his lips, finally turning to face the three shinobi. Ah well, since you caught me red-handed, there's no point in pretending now, is there? Orochimaru paused as he turned to fully face his former sensei, the weak light of the room only highlighting his sickly features. Even his yellow snake-like eyes seemed to glow lightly in the darkness of the room. It's simply my research. I'm developing a new jutsu. Naruto finally couldn't hold back any longer. The man in front of him was sick. No kind of jutsu is worth the lives you destroyed, you sick snake. The snake Sunin turned to the masked redhead with an almost mirthful smile. I was wondering when little Naruto-kun was going to speak up. Maybe a fox had your tongue. He laughed briefly at his own joke, meeting the frigid gazes of his opponents. Hiruzen looked down at the ground in despair over his fallen pupil. It's forbidden jutsu you're after, isn't it? But what is it you want? Why are you doing this? Orochimaru tore his gaze away from Naruto to stare smugly at Hiruzen, an almost maniacal gleam overtaking his eyes, smiling at his teacher's heavy words. I want everything. Every jutsu in the world. And even those yet to be discovered. I shall become all-knowing and all-powerful. Naruto stepped forward in anger, his tanto already drawn and at the ready. You're crazy. That's impossible. Even if you manage to learn all the jutsu, what about bloodlines? You'll never get your slimy hands on those. You'll never have everything. Orochimaru snarled in the redhead's direction before his face managed to return to his more neutral smirk. Maybe you're right, Naruto-kun, maybe if I were a weak fool like sensei. He added, but with time there comes possibility. And I plan on having all the time in the world to find all the techniques and knowledge I want. Eventually, I will have what I desire. He took a step forward, causing both members of Umbu to step in front of their Hokage, while Hiruzen himself raised his hands ready for hand signs. But what are you going to do, sensei? Kill me? Naruto stepped forward with his blade raised up at eye level. If he doesn't, then I will, you bastard. Orochimaru leered as he brought his own hands up in preparation, a wicked, warped laugh filling the bunker. Ah, Naruto-kun. Your voice is so sweet, so full of disgust and confusion. You would be amusing to play with, but will you find my precious Anko-chan, I wonder? Do you have time to waste with me? Naruto growled beneath his mask as he took another step forward just as Hiruzen slammed the floor. The flash of smoke was all the distraction Naruto needed as he sprinted forward, seemingly disappearing from the spot before materializing behind Orochimaru. The Sunin paid him almost no attention as he flipped through hand signs almost tauntingly slowly. Before Naruto could land a hit, the air around Orochimaru exploded outwards, shattering the various jars along the walls and ending with Naruto shooting across the room to impact painfully with the far wall, his body crunching. His body left an imprint in the rotten wood, holding him up despite his aching muscles' protests, splinters piercing into his back. By the time he managed to get to his feet again, Orochimaru was already out the door, the other Umbu operative dead on the floor while Hiruzen just watched, frozen in place. Hokage-sama, orders. When Hiruzen didn't respond, Naruto gritted his teeth and ran past the aging Hokage, sprinting through the corridor they had entered by. He was too late though. By the time he jumped up the stone stairs leading into the complex, Orochimaru was long gone. Naruto desperately looked around him, almost absently dismissing the various dead Umbu members lying on the ground around the entrance. He fell to his knees, staring down at the blood-stained ground as his hands clenched into fists so hard he began to draw blood from his palm. Anko. He wanted to say her name, but his voice was lost to him. A great ache pulled at his senses, his whole body tingling with the desire to run. But to where? Where was she? Naruto grunted slightly as he pulled roughly on his tanto, ripping it out of the body lying on the ground. He cursed under his breath as he looked around the small lab he was in, content to let the small rivulets of blood drip lazily down the length of his short sword. He narrowed his eyes as he looked down on Amaka's dead body, the man's formerly silver hair stained by the growing pool of blood beneath him. Damn bastard. The man had caused him and his team nothing but trouble since they arrived in the land of sea. They had been called out because of rumors saying one of Orochimaru's bases was out here. Currently, the Leaf Shinobi were stretched rather thin, so Naruto had personally asked for the mission, as well as a few fellow Umbu that were available. He sighed as one of his teammates dropped down next to him, a young man with jet black hair and a mask with a depiction of a rabbit. It was disconcerting working without Shisui or Itachi, but due to the flexible nature of Umbu missions and duties it was rare for the three of them to be assigned to the same mission, not that they didn't make time to hang out or train together. He turned to the other operative, staring at them through his tiger mask with a blank, expectant expression. It was amazing how much you picked up on body language when everybody you worked with wore masks almost constantly. Yes, Usagi. The Umbu quickly nodded, his posture and stance purely professional. It spoke of experience within the organization. We've scoured the entire base, all of Orochimaru's research notes that weren't destroyed are being collected and the human test subjects have been released to their families. Naruto nodded grimly. It was sickening what Amici had been doing in the base, experimenting on live people. And he left the question hanging in the air as the Umbu in front of him sighed slowly. It was no secret to the personal mission Naruto had set himself on ever since confronting Orochimaru with the Hokage. I'm sorry Tora, there's no sign of her. Naruto said nothing, but his hand clenching into a tight fist was words enough. This was the fourth base they had taken down and he was no closer to finding Anko than he had been before. Thank you, we'll meet up in a few hours and head back to the Leaf to make our report. Usagi nodded quickly before vanishing in a whirl of leaves, leaving Naruto to his thoughts as he looked around the now empty lab. Damn it Anko, where are you? Chapter 10, New Problems. The trio of Umbu were jumping through the tall trees on the small island in the direction of the coast to charter a boat back to the mainland. The atmosphere was quite tense within the group. After what they had seen inside the base, none were in the mood for talking. Naruto especially was quiet. It was strange for his temporary teammates. Throughout his first year in Umbu, Naruto and Shisui were always the ones trying to make conversation. Suddenly the redhead stopped in a branch ahead of them, forcing them both to come to a rest next to him. "What is it, Tora?" Naruto just looked left out over the beach with slightly narrowed eyes. It was fading, but there was a barely visible trail of footprints leading out over the sand. "I don't know, we might as well check it out though." His two teammates looked between themselves uncertainly but nodded all the same. Naruto had been put in charge of this mission, and as uncomfortable as the two experienced Umbu were with being led by an 12-year-old kid, there was no mistaking Naruto's abilities. They took off, quickly racing across the beach while leaving barely any trace of their existence. Finally they caught a glimpse of a lone figure, limping painfully across the sand of the beach, clutching their shoulder. Naruto's heart raced as his eyes widened behind the mask. They had their purple hair done up in a spiky pineapple style. With a gasp, Naruto vanished from in front of his teammates, causing them to fall for a moment before they saw him reappear next to the lone person, catching them just as they collapsed from exhaustion. When they caught up, Naruto was gently rocking Anko in his lap, a single tear of happiness managing to roll out from behind his mask. "I found you." Anko hated waking up in hospitals. The pure odor of anesthetics and antibacterial sprays always burned in her nose and irritated her eyes. There was also the pain from the reason why she was in the hospital. On that day it was a dull but constant throb from behind her left shoulder. With a groan she managed to open her eyes only to immediately close them again as she was assaulted by the horrifically sterile whites of her hospital room. She tried again, more slowly this time, and tried to sit up against the protests of her sore and tired body. The aches just intensified as she struggled. Surprisingly, as soon as she did so, she felt a gentle but firm hand push her back down again. After a moment of natural subconscious resistance, the tired girl relented and allowed the oddly warm hand to guide her head back onto the pillow. She tried opening her eyes again, this time meeting some success as she caught sight of an all-too-familiar mop of red hair. She could have almost laughed from the absurdity, and for more than a few moments after that she thought she was hallucinating. "Anko, don't move, the doctor told me to tell you to stay still if you woke up." Of course, hearing his voice for herself had her immediately trying to sit up again, straining her bleary and tired eyes to see him. "Naruto." She heard a small chuckle before once again she was pressed back down onto the reasonably comfortable hospital bed. "What did I just tell you?" Anko managed a small laugh of her own as she settled back down with an equally humorless groan of discomfort. Immediately, she felt the bed shift as Naruto stood back up from where he had been perched, instead settling in the chair to her left. Finally she managed to open her eyes and see something other than fuzzy or swimming shapes dance across her vision. Instantly, she turned towards his voice, only to blink in confusion. She had been right about the shock of red hair she had seen, and she knew that its spiky and wild design could only belong to one person. However, the Naruto sitting in the chair next to her, if it even was him, was nothing like the one she had left behind all that time ago. 2 years had changed the redhead, she knew, and she had a feeling it wasn't just physically. However, he had definitely grown, filling out from his previous 4 foot 9 inches into a decent 5 foot 2. His hair had grown out, becoming spikier and shaggier, and from what he could tell his bangs had also lengthened, quite adequately framing his face. It was difficult to get anything else though due to the Umbu porcelain mask covering his features. She was surprised he would wear it around her, however upon thought she hadn't ever seen him take it off except for when he was at home before she left. Aside from that, she could also see he had kept up with his training, the fruits of which could now be seen in his firmly toned, tightly coiled, but still lithe frame. Lastly, he had the Umbu tattoo conspicuously imprinted on his right bicep, something that hadn't been there before her departure. She chuckled again weakly before flopping back down onto the bed. "You look dash an unsteady breath, different." Even she was slightly annoyed by how weak her voice sounded right then. It was hoarse and dry, which was pretty much how her aching, constricted throat felt anyway. Taking the hint, Naruto quickly got her a glass of water from a nearby pitcher, which she thankfully downed in a few long gulps. He watched her for a moment before sighing and leaning back further into the chair. "I can't say the same for you, Anko." He was partially right, at least. Other than growing taller, Anko had never really seen fit to change her style under Orochimaru's apprenticeship. fishnet stockings cinched tightly up her smooth legs to her usual beige shorts and dark navy t-shirt. However, to the more trained eye the rewards for her own training over that time were also visible in the way her legs and arms pinched or sloped inwardly in places, but not in a way that would alert anybody but with the most trained eye to her position as a rather deadly kunoichi. Shut up. They both shared a laugh as Anko playfully punched her oldest friend in the shoulder, only to wince as her own immediately began to burn. Immediately recoiling on herself and grasping the offending spot in pain, she could only bite her lip to stop a pained gasp coming from her mouth. Naruto could only look on in surprise and helplessness as Anko hunched over in pain, still clutching what he had at first assumed to be a tattoo, only to now see it glowing and pulsating a dangerous orange aura. Anko! He was right by her side, sitting hip to hip in an instant, looking over the mark in an attempt to see what was wrong. When he got no response, he shook her shoulders to get her attention, only for Anko to immediately recoil from him, her arm lashing out on instinct, her nails finding his mask. There was silence in the room for a moment as Anko stared first at Naruto, then at her own hands in horror. Likewise Naruto could only blink in shock as he brought his hand up to his mask, feeling the 4 thin lines Anko's nails had gouged through the material. Naruto, I. She couldn't continue and her voice sounded small and meek, still not quite believing any of this was real, refusing to. She gulped audibly as Naruto brought his hand back down, only to immediately clasp both of them over the one Anko was still staring at, horrified. His hands were warm beneath the soft fingerless gloves of his Umbu uniform, and even though Anko initially pulled away from him, he held on firmly. Anko, look at me. It took her a moment, but eventually the young kunoichi managed to tear her eyes away from the hand so tightly clasped over her own. She stared into his expressionless mask, idly noting the way the whisker marks that denoted it as the tiger mask reflected the ones he hid behind it. He moved a hand away from their small contact and gently removed his mask, finally allowing her to see his face. She stared at his deep purple eyes for a few seconds, neither of them saying anything before her entire body shook from a violent sob. She hadn't even noticed the tears trailing down her face until Naruto carefully brushed one from her cheek. The effect of the contact was instant. All the familiarity and nostalgia from his face broke down all the walls she had. A few moments later she was sobbing herself into a fitful sleep against Naruto's strong chest. In turn the redhead gently wrapped his arms around the crying girl, unsure what to do in a situation like this but finding his arms moving on instinct anyway. He stayed like that for at least 10 minutes, until he was certain Anko was asleep, before he very carefully slid her back onto the hospital bed. He took one last unobstructed look at her sleeping form before placing his mask back on and vanishing in a blur of red. Mission accomplished, Hokage-sama. Hiruzen nodded once from behind steepled fingers before leaning back in his old leather chair with an audible creak. Good work, Tora. I take it there were no complications. It wasn't really a question, even if he phrased it as such. With Naruto there weren't complications, not on any mission he had been on during his time in the Umbu. It was why the rest of the operatives looked forward to being on a squad with him. They almost treated him like a lucky charm. Well, actually, Hokage-sama. That alone had the elderly man quirking a single eyebrow, although years of experience told him this day would have to come eventually. The fact that Naruto seemed unusually hesitant about the subject also had him slightly on edge. It made him wonder if his old student had been sighted before dismissing it instantly. That was the type of thing that got reported the minute the team was back in the village, if not by messenger hawk. What is it? Naruto struggled with the answer for a moment, a tiny smile adorning his concealed features. It's Anko, Hokage-sama. We found her. Hiruzen let out a small sigh of relief, not that anybody in the office could hear the minuscule reaction. That seems like very good news, but why so hesitant to tell me? The hidden smile behind the whiskered mask twisted into fetid frown as the young redhead's eyes narrowed. It seems that Orochimaru did something to Anko during their training trip. He left some kind of awful mark on her shoulder, possibly a seal, that causes her pain. Hiruzen sat back in the chair again with another, more audible sigh. I see. Internally the older man was much more worried than his outward appearance would have anybody believe. Well, when Jiraiya is next in the village I can have him take a look. Very much out of character for Naruto, he quickly raised a hand to quiet the older Hokage in a way that he hoped wasn't too disrespectful. If I may, Hokage-sama, I would appreciate it if I could handle this issue personally. If it is a seal, then I believe I would be much better suited to dealing with it. Hiruzen eyed the young Umbu operative critically, the youngest they ever had in the village, before shaking his head slowly. I'm truly sorry, Tora-san. As much as I do not doubt your abilities, I would feel better knowing somebody with more experience dealt with this before it becomes a potential threat to the village. Hiruzen's eyes narrowed slightly further when he noticed Naruto's hand clench into a tight fist. Hokage-sama. Sarutobi couldn't help but notice the way Naruto stressed his title through gritted teeth. Anko is not a threat to this village, she is a kunoichi. The Hokage nodded serenely as he turned to the left, looking out the window overlooking his village. I agree emphatically, but that mark on her body is another issue, and until it is neutralized I have to look out for the best interests of the village. He sighed internally when Naruto's hands unclenched and his body language returned to that of his professional apathy, as was the norm in the Umbu Corp. He just seemed entirely exhausted then, unable to look at his leader in the eye for some reason. Very well, Hokage-sama, I will defer to your judgment. Hiruzen nodded sagely even as Naruto began to turn and leave the office. With a quick tap on the desk he halted the young shinobi before he could go too far. Tora. You have my permission to come up with a method of removing this mark, but you will not touch it before Jiraiya has a chance to look over it, am I understood? Naruto didn't say anything, but his frozen body spoke more than any words ever could. He nodded once before quickly hurrying out of the office and disappearing in his unique shunshin. Naruto pounded the desk in monstrous frustration, his fist knocking one of the many scattered scrolls on the surface to the floor. Each of them were filled with complicated sealing arrays and sketches, most of which stemmed from one simple illustration of the wicked mark currently adorning Anko's neck. He was agonizing over how little progress he had made, his heart pounding in the fingers that held his sealing brushes, muscles often spasming at the worst moments. At this rate he wouldn't have done enough to help Anko by the time Jiraiya was next in the village. Although knowing the habits of the famous Toad Sage, as all Umbu were required to, that could be any time from the next day to a month from now. All he had worked out so far was that each tomo of the mark in the Mitsudum design had a different purpose when expanded out. Like he had, though it was a vast and complicated sealing array condensed down into a form that could easily be transferred onto a subject. He assumed that was what the two other, still not fully healed marks on her neck were, either from injections or, much more worryingly, a bite mark. One of the tomo seemed to be a simple chakra storage seal, although its design was beyond many things Naruto had ever seen, allowing for truly vast amounts of chakra to not only be stored, but be collected as well. That was where his limits were. He had no idea how such a thing was possible without a direct transfer of chakra into the seal. This one just seemed to absorb it from who knew where. There was also something about it he couldn't understand, something about the intake array that confused him, but he couldn't quite place. The next tomo of the seal was completely beyond him. It seemed more like a fuinjutsu version of an intravenous drip in his opinion. Unfortunately he couldn't find out exactly what would be injected into the system. Luckily, that part didn't seem to be active at the moment, which was a small relief. Still, it was obvious to him that knowledge of sealing wouldn't be enough when it came to Orochimaru's handiwork. He would need a medical ninja with him when the time came to remove the seal. Finally, and most horrifically in Naruto's opinion, the last tomo of the seal was more than obvious to the young redhead. He had seen many versions of the inner workings before in slave camps and even some prison institutes like Hojokijo. It was designed to send enormous amounts of electricity directly through the mark-bearer's nervous system with the application of a certain hand seal. It was also coded directly to Orochimaru's chakra through a small amount stored within the first tomo. Eventually, too tired and irritated to fret over his total inability to help his friend, Naruto pushed away from his desk, leaving his scattered workings for tomorrow. He ran a hand through his unruly hair as a sigh escaped his mouth before standing up and lurching towards the door. He blinked, not realizing just how tired he was until now, and moved lazily through the house towards his room. He stopped, however, just outside of Anko's room where he could easily hear her moving about, despite knowing she was still asleep. He was thankful the doctors had let him take her home, despite some of their protests. There was nothing physically wrong with her aside from slight exhaustion, and there was nothing they could do about the curse mark any more than Naruto could. Still tired, but now worried about his friend and tenant, he slowly opened her door a crack to make sure she was okay. He could only look on in sadness as he saw her bed, soaked in sweat, with a writhing Anko rolling about on top of her disorganized sheets that had become unbound from her body at some point. With a long sigh, he walked in quietly, padding across the floorboards until he was looking over her pained and frightened form. He placed a hand on her cold and sweaty shoulder and the effects were immediate. She stopped moving, her breathing calmed and the frightened mask that was her face settled into a more neutral, but still slightly pained expression. Naruto smiled, glad that he could help at least a little, before he carefully maneuvered Anko's body until the sheets were back over her form. He stood up to leave again but a hand firmly holding onto his wrist didn't allow him to. He looked back around to see Anko staring back at him with half-lidded eyes, her mind still deep within the realms of sleep. Noting that it was only reflexive, Naruto attempted to prise Anko's hand off his arm, only for her to pull him even more intently towards her. Still half awake, her other hand sought out his body and reluctantly he allowed her to grab his other hand, once again pulling his body towards her. With another small, but not wholly unwelcome sigh, he resigned himself to being Anko's comfort toy as she pulled him the rest of the way into her bed. Only half conscious, she securely wrapped her arms around the warm and soft object she had found in her slightly delirious state. Anko was sweaty and her skin was slightly clammy from the cold night air, but even so, Naruto couldn't help but feel comfortable in that embrace, with his friend's arms wrapped around him. On instinct he pulled her a little closer, an action the girl didn't seem to mind in the slightest if her contented sigh was anything to go on, and wrapped his arms around her slimmer frame in turn. "It's okay, Anko. It's going to be okay now." His only response was a small whimper that was lost to the silence and darkness of the small room. "So, you're Jiraiya." The large man standing in front of him simply grinned, his eyebrows wiggling almost comically. "The one and only. Although I am known around the nations by many names, I prefer the much more humble Toad Sage of MT. Miyabaku. The mighty and inexhaustible." His eyebrows wiggled again in that same manner, even though he now seemed to be looking into what Naruto could only think of as the foreground, the gallant Jiraiya. Naruto simply gave him a blank look, not that it was really required from behind his mask. Right. He did his best to keep himself straight-faced. No need to antagonize the only person who could help them. To his left, Anko was giving the strange man an equally exasperated if barely subdued look, her eye twitching in irritation. "Aren't you that pervert that always gets the crap beaten out of him by the hot springs?" Jiraiya just laughed in an offhanded manner, waving his hands in a well-practiced placating manner as he turned his attention to the young kunoichi. "So you're Anko Mitarashi, my old teammate's apprentice." Everybody in the room could immediately feel the temperature drop. To his relief, Anko managed to show some rare restraint and settled for just glaring at the white-haired pervert. "All right then, let me take a look at the seal." The blinks of confusion were almost audible as Jiraiya's attitude became surprisingly serious. Anko was so surprised by the change she simply complied without a word of protest, turning around and pulling down her shirt slightly to reveal the curse mark. Jiraiya took his time studying the mark, his hand resting against his chin in thought as his eyes schemed over every detail with a professional gaze. Finally, he looked up, seemingly having a silent conversation with his sensei with just their eyes communicating. He took a step back with a sigh that had Naruto and Anko immediately worried. "I would have to open up the seal and have a more in-depth look to be sure, but at a precursory glance, I can't remove this." He shook his head tiredly at the gazes of shock and disappointment he received from Naruto and Anko respectively. "The best I can do is place a restriction seal around it, but even that would be purely determined by your will not to use the mark." At this point Naruto's eyes was convulsing and he had never been more thankful for his mask hiding his face. A restriction seal. He could have done that. "Unfortunately, my old teammate seems to be living up to his praises as a genius. He has somehow worked in some very complicated medical ninjutsu into the seal. I couldn't remove it if I tried." He looked up in thought, staring out the window forlornly. "Maybe if Tsunade were here." He sighed before shaking his head. Both he and his sensei knew that was a lost cause. Anyway, the good news is that the whole array seems benign. Orochimaru can't activate unless he is nearby. Anko's fists were clenched shut at this point and her whole body was shaking slightly. "What the hell kind of good does that do me? How the hell am I supposed to get back at that bastard if I can't even get near him? And what the hell do you mean benign? I can't get to sleep at night for hours because of this thing." A single tear was rolling angrily down her rage-filled face. Jiraiya could only sigh in defeat. "I'm sorry, but there's nothing I can do." Anko was just about ready to lash out at the man before a firm hand caught her wrist. She just looked around at Naruto in confusion before sighing and hanging her head in defeat. At that moment Naruto stepped forward, eyeing Jiraiya carefully as the older Sannin did the same to him. "You're wrong." Jiraiya just raised an eyebrow in amusement at the Stoikumbu questioning him. "Oh really? About what?" Naruto just stood there impassively, not giving even the slightest hints he had a reaction. If his Umbu captain had seen him then, staring down a Sannin, he would have been proud, at least before he asked the Sannin for an autograph. Even if you can't remove the seal entirely due to the chemical contained in one of the tomo, you could still do more than just restrict it. Jiraiya chuckled rather obnoxiously, laughing as if nothing he said could be wrong. "Listen kid, you're a few years short of questioning my decisions when it comes to sealing, let the grown UPS handle this." Again, Naruto remained impassive, ignoring the man's jibe in favor of pulling out a scroll from his back pouch and handing it over. Jiraiya took it with another amused smirk before glancing it over briefly. Even a small check showed him it was filled nearly to the brim with various sealing designs and arrays, none of which he could spot any problems or faults with. That would be what most people saw, however Jiraiya was not most people, he was a sealing master. He instantly spotted the unmistakable signs of Uzumaki techniques, having had the privilege of learning a few from Minato, and indirectly Kushina. Before he could read much more Naruto quickly took the scroll back off him without a word and replaced it in his pouch, right next to the one that would explode rather violently if opened, each looking identical of course. "Well kid, as impressive as all that was, you still don't have my experience, especially when it comes to Orochimaru. Trust me, you don't want to go messing around with his handiwork, he's the type to cover his tracks extremely well." Naruto said nothing, stepping back to where he had been standing originally. Hiruzen just sighed deeply, leaning further back in his chair as he contemplated the options before him. "Well in that case I'll have to allow Jiraiya to place the restriction seal, in any case." "Wait." All three other occupants of the room turned to Anko with some modicum of surprise. "If he..." She pointed to Naruto, knowing better than to say his name while he wore the mask, "says he can remove the seal then I want him to try." Jiraiya looked somewhat offended, however that same offense seemed too exaggerated to be genuine so Anko did not relent. Hiruzen on the other hand, looked at Anko more critically. His pipe moving to the other side of his mouth in momentary thought, he gave her a glazed look, "Really Anko-chan?" A slight shiver went up the girl's spine as she remembered all the times her sensei would call her that. Jiraiya is the village's foremost expert when it comes to seals and while Tora-san is particularly adept, I am more inclined to defer to Jiraiya's judgment. He shot a small apologetic look at Naruto who didn't even turn his head. "I don't care. If it means getting this damn thing off I'll do anything." Nobody could see but there was a small smirk of victory adorning Naruto's features, partly at being chosen over a Sannin and partly at seeing some of Anko's old fire back in her attitude. Sarutobi stared at Anko a little longer, weighing everything up in his mind. "I'm not going to be able to change your mind on this am I?" Anko just shook her head with a slight defiant smirk and Hiruzen could already feel the oncoming headache. "Very well, I leave the removal or sealing of the mark up to you Anko, unless it becomes a hazard to the village, then I will have to take action." Anko nodded once in understanding. Jiraiya seemed like there was more he wanted to say but he kept his mouth closed until he could speak with his sensei in private. On the way out the white-haired Sannin caught Naruto's arm, turning him slightly so he could look right into his masked face. "I hope you know what you're doing, kid." Behind the mask Naruto's eyes narrowed and he quickly slipped his arm out of the hold. "I would never do anything to harm Anko." Jiraiya just sighed as he allowed the young man to leave. "Maybe not intentionally." His parting words were left unheard as Naruto had already disappeared in a blur of red, taking Anko with him. The older man sighed deeply to himself as he turned around to his sensei, the much older man blissfully blowing out a thin stream of smoke from his pipe. "I don't understand how you can be so calm, sensei. A kid that young? He could kill her if he gets the sealing wrong." Hiruzen just continued to puff on his pipe, his gaze absently wandering to the window where he could look out of the village. "You should have more faith in him Jiraiya." Maybe if you were around more you would better understand his abilities. Jiraiya sighed with a small smirk. Not this conversation again, sensei. You know how busy I am with the spy network, I always have to be moving if I want to catch any leads on Orochimaru. Plus, I still have to find the child of prophecy the great Toad Sage spoke of. Jiraiya looked down sadly. He had put all his hopes into Minato, the once-in-a-generation genius that he was lucky to find. He looked up again in thought, idly gazing out the same window as his aged sensei. Do you think the boy would object to going on a training trip with me? I could really hone his sealing abilities, maybe pass on a few of my techniques and maybe even the toad contact. Hiruzen shook his head slowly, finally looking away from the village and back to his desk. I do not know Jiraiya, but if he finds out you are his godfather. He left the sentence hanging knowing full well it would remind Jiraiya of another particular redhead's temperament. Jiraiya got the message and gulped loudly, absently rubbing a spot on his side that was the result of a peeping he would never forget. Yeah, well, I guess you're right. Hiruzen merely shrugged, already sorting through the mess of papers on his desk. I never said he would object, just that you had better be ready to face the consequences. Jiraiya nodded with a small frown before simply vanishing in his usual manner. He decided to place the problem to the back of his mind for now. Maybe he could find the child of prophecy yet, he just had to maintain his faith. Anko was surprisingly quiet as the two of them walked through the streets of Konoha towards the Namikaze estate. Naruto kept taking glances at her from behind his mask but she just kept her gaze low and pensive. Were you serious back there? If Naruto hadn't been standing right next to her he might have missed her voice, it came out so meek. Of course. Anko just nodded, reaffirming her choice in her mind. She believed that if Naruto said he could remove the mark then he could do it. You better. If you don't I'll kick your ass myself. They both chuckled, or at least Anko did. Naruto just vaguely shook his shoulders, he was still an Umbu after all. I'd like to see you try. Just because you've been on a training trip doesn't mean you're at my level yet. Anko raised an amused eyebrow, thankful for the diversion from her darkening thoughts. Big words. Care to back them up? Naruto smiled broadly behind the mask as he picked up the pace slightly, using long strides that Anko couldn't quite match. If you think you can keep up. He immediately disappeared in a red blur with Anko hot on his heels in a leaf shunshin that had a little extra impact than usual. The sound of her echoing laughter caused a few civilians in the street to turn their heads only to see the settling leaves in her wake. Shisui sighed happily as he walked through the streets in the direction of his friend's house. He had just gotten back from a long mission outside of the village and it felt good to be out of his stifling uniform. He especially hated the mask, while his two best friends took quite well to the emotionless, stoic appeal of the Umbu, he wasn't quite as comfortable. He now had a better idea of why so few people did more than 5 years in the organization. Something like that for too long could mess with your head. He entered Naruto's back garden through the side gate. He could usually find the redhead here either training or just enjoying the sun. He was surprised then to find his friend crouched in the center of his training field in a ready stance, his eyes carefully scanning his surroundings. Shisui had no idea who he could be sparring with. Itachi was still on a mission and he only sparred with other Umbu operatives in their special training grounds. Suddenly, 4 snakes erupted from the ground all around the redhead, immediately crashing into the lone Namikaze. Shisui was shocked for a moment, not understanding at all what was going on, at least until Naruto burst into a cloud of smoke. Not soon after he heard a grunt of pain and a purple blur was thrown into the middle of the field from the tree line. He was even more shocked when the figure revealed herself to be Anko, an older Anko than the last time he saw her. Hey! You said you wouldn't use shadow clones. Shisui turned to see a chuckling Naruto emerge from the same area Anko had been thrown from. He was still wearing the standard Umbu uniform and body armor but had removed his tanto and mask. And the fact that you believed me shows you still aren't ready for me to take you seriously. He said it with a jesting smirk but Shisui could tell the comment got to Anko if her scowl told him anything. However, it was immediately covered up with a devious smirk as she walked closer to Naruto. The redhead immediately tensed in a subtle way that would allow him to react to anything Anko threw at him. However, he was definitely not expecting her to suddenly grab his shoulder and pull him towards her so she could plant her lips firmly on his own. Both Naruto and Shisui could only stare, wide-eyed, as Anko deepened the kiss. The redhead's body went slack from the shock. That was the exact opportunity Anko used to squarely knee Naruto in the side, making him double over in pain. She quickly flipped over his body, lashing out again with her foot to catch him on the other side before pulling him back and holding a kunai to his throat. Or maybe you're not ready for me to take you seriously if you'd fall for a ploy like that. The redhead in her hold blinked one last time before gaining a smirk of his own. Wrong again. Anko cursed as once again the Naruto she had captured burst into a cloud of smoke. At this point Shisui was still not comprehending what was going on, his mind was having trouble rebooting. Anko. The kunoichi turned cautiously at the familiar voice before her eyes settled on one of her other friends. Shisui. Said boy suddenly found himself in a bone-crushing hug that actually lifted him off his feet for a moment before the overly energetic girl set him down again and parted. Oh, are we done? It was Naruto who spoke, emerging from the tree line again from a different position, as if he had been there the whole time. Knowing Naruto the way Shisui did, he probably had. Naruto? What's going on? When did Anko get back? Naruto simply responded with a warm smile aimed at both of them. Come on, I'll explain it all inside. Shisui nodded dumbly before following the two of them into the house, the reason for him coming over completely forgotten. Chapter 11, New Surprises. Weird, isn't it? Shisui's whispered voice slightly echoed around the small clearing where three masked shinobi could be seen seated around a small fire. Less noticeable was the ever so slightly effervescent glow of the seal array surrounding them. It both masked their presence from anybody who might stumble upon them while at the same time protecting them from somebody powerful enough to see through the barrier. What? Naruto looked up from his meal of warmed rations. It definitely wasn't his favorite, but there generally wasn't much option for food out on a mission, especially for Umbu. Unlike regular shinobi of the hidden villages, Umbu weren't allowed to simply walk into other towns or villages in their uniforms, and removal of their masks on duty was strictly prohibited. Well, when was the last time us three were sent on a mission together, especially without Inu Taijo? Itachi just nodded his head once, seeming more in thought than his two comrades. I don't know why you're complaining, Tori. I thought you would be happy to have the team back together. Shisui nodded slowly with a small smile behind his mask. In truth, he was happy. Only seeing his friends in training and between missions had become too tiresome. He missed the thrill of working alongside his two best friends. Yeah, you're right, never mind. Naruto just smiled and returned to eating his food, never once removing his mask, which never ceased to amaze Anko when he did it at home. It was a skill all Umbu learned at some point or another, purely for the convenience it afforded them. Even so, the redhead began to think about Shisui's words. It was true the three of them had never actually gone on a mission all together during their time in Umbu. To do so now, without their captain nonetheless, certainly was strange. We should get moving again. Itachi's calm voice interrupted both his musings and his dinner, and with quite a bit of grumbling from his bird and tiger-masked friends, the three of them packed their dinner, destroyed their presence in the clearing, and shot off into the trees. Never once did they notice the set of steel-gray eyes watching them from the shadows. Deep in the land of rain there is a large field, famous for shinobi as the place where the fourth Kazekage, the fourth Hokage and the third Chuchikage all met to discuss the end of the third shinobi war. It was a miserable place, barren and lifeless from the copious amount of blood spilled across its muddy ground. Rain poured ceaselessly from the darkened sky, and not a single iota of healthy plant life could be spotted anywhere in sight. It was here that Itachi, Shisui and Naruto all appeared via their typical methods of shunshin. All three of them gazed around the place with a sigh, knowing full well the reputation of the land they were standing in. It wasn't long before they were joined by three more blurs, which quickly resolved into men in similar attire to their own. They too wore the staple animal mask of a hidden village's Umbu, as well as the grey body armor that marked them above regular shinobi. Good, you arrived. We were beginning to think you Konoha dogs wouldn't show up. The blatant slur was completely ignored by the three stoic leaf ninja. Instead, Naruto simply opted to pull the large scroll of his back, planting it on the ground with a small thud. Do you have the prisoner? His voice was cold and purely professional, which elicited a grin from the leader of the opposing shinobi, not that it went seen behind his mask. We had heard you leaf ninja were cold, but to see it firsthand. He made a tooting noise with his teeth after a small chuckle escaped his mouth. Do you have the prisoner? Naruto's voice never wavered, maintaining the perfect emotionless edge all Umbu were trained to use in situations like these. The leader of the other ninja simply sighed irritable before motioning to one of his companions. Yeah, geez. The man to his right disappeared for a moment before returning with a limp form slung across his shoulders like a shepherd might carry one of his flock. There's your guy, happy? Now show us our man. His voice hitched slightly at the end in irritation and obvious anger, but none of the leaf shinobi acted on it. Instead, Naruto simply unfurled the overly large scroll in one smooth motion, releasing the captive ninja inside with a burst of smoke. Before the slightly dazed man could do anything, he had been grasped by Naruto and immediately had a tanto held to his neck. What's going on? The poor captive was too dazed to think clearly. One moment he had been in his cell, about to go to sleep, the next he was standing out in some kami-forsaken field with the biting rain pouring down on him. Stay calm, we are trading you back to your forces in return for one of our own. The captive merely blinked in confusion again, his mind too muddled to properly take in the situation. The other Umbu seemed unfazed by the gleaming sword held to their comrade's throat. It was fairly standard procedure to keep the hostage from running. All right. We'll release your shinobi at the same moment you release ours. All he got was a curt nod from Naruto, who was more focused on keeping his blade no more than an inch from his captive's throat. When the man gulped, he could feel the razor-sharp steel brush his neck. There was a moment of silence between the two groups before the ninja carrying the leaf hostage began to walk forward at the same time Naruto did, still maintaining that inch of breathing room at all times. There was a moment when the ever-present noise of the rain seemed to dull for a moment as the two men passed one another. Now. Before anybody could blink, the ninja walking forward raised his hand, simultaneously dropping the leaf hostage on his shoulder. Naruto could do nothing as his tanto was wrenched from his hand by an unseen force. The moment of confusion and hesitation was all it took for the enemy shinobi to grab their hostage in one hand, throw him back towards their group and slash through the leaf hostage's throat in one fell swoop. Naruto could only stare at the spray of crimson arcing through the air for a single second before he was forced to suddenly jump backwards to avoid meeting the same fate. He landed back between his comrades, who had both taken ready stances, their individual Sharingan flaring behind their masks. He adopted a similar pose as they all glared at the group of enemy ninja in front of them, all of whom were now smirking in a mocking fashion behind their masks. What are you doing? Don't you know this could mean war between Konoha and Iwa? Shisui's voice rang out clearly across the field, despite the pounding rain muffling everything else. Even now the three could only watch the steadily growing pool of blood beneath their comrade. Finally got you to break those cool and collected masks, did we? Whatever, it's not like anybody is going to find out about this once you three are all dead. Naruto settled back into his fighting stance. The oldest amongst the Iwa ninja immediately recognized it, his eyes swelling in eager fright. I know that stance. But that should be impossible. Only one other man ever fought using that style. He stared excitedly under his mask as his companions glared at him and Naruto strangely. So, you're the Dim Flash's brat. Am I right? He chuckled dryly behind his mask as he made a motion with his hand. Oh, that just makes this all the better. Oh, I can't wait to make you scream my name. Immediately they were surrounded on all sides as 10 more Iwaambu suddenly appeared from where they had been hiding underground. All of them just seemed to stare at the redhead incredulously, not quite believing they were really facing against the Fourth's legacy. Guys, what do? We're good but not that good. Shisui's voice was hushed so their opponents couldn't hear them. Before any of them could reply, the leader of the Iwaambu called out, Hey! If you think we're just going to stand here and let you plan, then you sure do think us fools. Immediately the backup squadron of Iwa shinobi leapt into action, rushing forward to cordon off the leaf group before they could escape. Suddenly, all three of them became locked into a flurry as they were all ganged up on by at least 4 different ninja. Gray and black blurs filled the air, earth techniques slamming into the ground as Naruto, Shisui and Itachi duck and span. Quickly the already muddy and desolate battlefield was transformed into a compacted war zone as earth was uprooted and large gashes and trenches appeared across the ground. Naruto had managed to snatch one of the tantos from an enemy ninja's back and was using it to deflect kunai that seemed to come from everywhere around him. Normally he would have spared a glance at his comrades, but he was sure he would only get hit if that happened. He suddenly pivoted on one foot, only to slip slightly on the muddy ground. The slight stumble cost him as he felt the large slash from on his arm. He stifled a cry of pain as he jumped to the side, avoiding a more lethal gash that might have taken his head off. His grinning opponent didn't relent though, he just rushed forward again, intent on being the one who took out the fourth Hokage's son. Meanwhile one of his companions was rushing through hand seals at an impossible pace. Earth Release, Mudslide Jutsu. The already unforgiving terrain under his feet became a soupy quagmire and his feet were immediately taken out from under him, slimy flows threatening to bury him in neck deep. It was only by sheer reflex he reached out with a hand, grabbing onto a nearby stretch of reasonable solid ground and using chakra to anchor himself before pulling up. At the same moment he lashed out with his leg, catching one of the other Umbu who had been trying to get close and take him out with a long katana. He landed back on solid ground but not without a wince. He had used his injured arm to soften his fall and was paying the price for it. His eyes widened as he suddenly dropped to the floor, narrowly avoiding the gleaming blade that passed inches overhead. Using his momentum he rolled before springing back up, pulling his hands together painfully to quickly flash through hand seals in a moment of respite. Wind Release, Gale Shuriken Jutsu. All around him the wind coalesced into 10 rotating blades of wind that immediately dispersed outwards with a blast of pressurized air. Most of his opponents dodged out of the way, which caused Naruto to smirk behind his mask before leaping back from another precise attack, his hands never straying from the dog seal. The cries of pain rang out through the large battleground as the wind shuriken suddenly turned around midair, embedding themselves into 3 of Naruto's attackers. Unfortunately for him, they didn't hit any vital spots, but at least now he wasn't the only one with an injury, their flesh torn and mangled along the outside of their legs and arms, impeding movement with pounding agony. Damn you Namikaze brat! Earth Style, Devouring Earth Jutsu. Suddenly the ground shook as large boulders ripped themselves from the earth, forming into an enormous maw that quickly tried to eat Naruto. He jumped away, but the jutsu simply followed after him, clamping down around his body with a sickening crunch. One of the Iwaambu sighed in relief, glad that their fight was over relatively quickly. The sigh died in his mouth as they all heard a strange pulsating sound from behind them. Rasengan! Before anybody could react, Naruto suddenly appeared in their midst with a glowing sphere of blue energy. He slammed it into one of his faceless opponents, the sound of skin being torn and bones being grinded into dust echoing in everybody's ears. There was a moment of calm as Naruto stood there, panting from how fast he had to substitute with a seal-less shadow clone to pull that off. So you really are the fourth's kid? Naruto didn't answer as he looked at the man, simply dropping into a fighting stance and ignoring the pain in his arm. Itachi wasn't faring much better. While his Sharingan allowed him to quite easily predict their movements and act accordingly, their sheer numbers were causing him problems. While one would attack from the front and draw his attention, another would attack him from a blind spot, effectively countering the advantages the Sharingan gave him. While he had 2 of them under Genjutsu, it proved difficult to do the same with their comrades, as it took a lot of concentration to keep even that much up while fighting at the same time. To make matters worse, every so often one would break off and free their friends by pulsing chakra through their systems. Itachi was hard-pressed to just keep ahead of his opponents, and he couldn't even spare a passing thought to his friends, knowing they would have to just deal with it right now. He blocked another Tonto strike with his own before melting into a flock of crows, quickly encircling his attacker before having to break off to avoid his companion. His normally stoic face was marred by a look of pure concentration he only ever took in his most heated spars with Naruto. Behind his mask, his 3 Tomo Sharingan spun erratically as he attempted to predict every one of his enemy's movements, only to be blindsided once again. He grunted in pain as he felt a slash through the back of his leg before he spun, lashing out with his blade to return the favor, only to see his opponent jump away. On reflex, he suddenly dropped to the ground, gulping slightly as an enormous ball of flame roared over his head. The heat alone made him sweat beneath his armor before it was swept away by the all-encompassing rain. He dashed back to his feet, jumping away from another well-coordinated attack before racing through hand seals of his own. You call that a fireball? Fire Release, Great Fireball Jutsu. He finished with the tiger seal and breathed out, expelling a concentrated stream of fire which quickly grew into an enormous sphere of pure flame, well over 3 times his own height. He sent it careening forward, digging out a small trench of earth in its wake. 3 of his opponents all dodged out of the way, one of them getting slightly singed by his slow reaction. Their genjutsu-controlled comrade wasn't so lucky. He took the jutsu directly, his body being incinerated instantly. Itachi panted slightly as he regained his breath, using the momentary pause in the fighting to once again eye up his opponents, who only glared back with undisguised hatred. "You'll pay for that, Konoha scum." Itachi did not respond as he rushed forward, Tonto gleaming in the weak light. Shisui was just barely having an easier time. Any time an enemy would get close enough to do damage, he would disappear in a surging tornado of leaves, only to reappear right behind one of their unsuspecting comrades. Already his opponents were covered in light bruises and various cuts that were slowly eating at their stamina. That wasn't to say Shisui was fine either. He was really exerting himself to keep up with so many highly skilled opponents, his muscles protesting after several awkward, hurried maneuvers. They had quickly caught on to his abilities and were now keeping their distance, launching long-range jutsu at him from where he couldn't reach them easily. He seemed to have drawn the short end of the stick as he found himself facing against the leader of the enemy Umbu group, the red patch on his mask identifying him as an Umbu captain. The fight was dragging on, and as time passed Shisui felt more and more of his energy draining away while his opponents seemed hardly phased. He vanished again, hoping to surprise his opponent as he reappeared in midair, a usually impossible stunt using the shunshin. His plan failed though, as he was forced to twist his body in midair to avoid a hail of shuriken and kunai before he could even think about attacking the Umbu captain. He was forced back again, doing his best to dodge or deflect the weapons being sent his way. Every so often one would get past his defenses, nicking his leg or scraping across his arm guards. He stood back, panting with his Tonto held in front of him in a cross guard, wondering why his assailants had suddenly stopped. The answer became quickly obvious as the rest of the Iwa ninja reappeared, throwing the tired and bloodied forms of Naruto and Itachi down on the ground in front of them. "Surrender, Konoha trash, or your friends will die." Shisui's eyes widened behind his mask. He never would have thought his friends would be captured. In fact, Shisui had always considered himself the weakest of the 3, always trailing behind Naruto and Itachi in skill. To see them so defeated and helpless, it was paralyzing. The Uchiha could only gulp as he stood there, motionless. "Didn't you hear me? I said surrender or we'll cut their throats." As if to put that point across, his friends were suddenly wrenched into kneeling positions, blades poised in front of their necks ready to end their lives. Shisui didn't know what to do. If he ran in his exhausted condition, he would never get away before they caught him, plus he would never be able to live with himself. If he surrendered, then they would all be taken captive and most likely tortured for any information they had. Umbu procedures dictated he should kill himself in this situation, but they would still get Naruto and Itachi. He stood there, trembling slightly with frustration and rage as his knuckles turned white from gripping his Tonto too hard. He didn't know what to do. His mind raced at a mile a minute and his Sharingan spun wildly, unconsciously reshaping into a shape reminiscent of a 4-pronged shuriken. The enemy Umbu captain just smirked behind his mask, reveling in the indecision and pure fear of his enemy. "Koda Amatsukami." It was barely a whisper, completely inaudible beneath the roar of the pouring rain smothering the field. However, beneath his mask the enemy captain's eyes suddenly dilated, his body becoming unresponsive for a single moment before he returned to normal. His hand suddenly shot up, shocking the rest of his squad as he motioned for the 2-leaf Umbu to be released. "Let them go." The other Iwa ninja only looked on in shock, none of them moving for a moment before the captain rounded on them angrily. "Didn't you hear me? I said release them." A man to his left looked between his commander and the 2 prisoners, who seemed equally amazed. "But Taijo." His voice was as unsure as the rest of them felt. "But nothing, this is a direct order. We have what we came for, now release them." After a moment of indecision, Itachi and Naruto were hesitantly released. The 2 quickly used the opportunity to race across to Shisui, who continued to stare at the enemy captain with a level glare. "We're done here." He made another motion and the entire squad raced off back towards their own country. "What the hell?" Naruto was just as confused as he stood there, watching the enemy ninja retreat from sight steadily. His concentration was wrecked though as Shisui suddenly wilted where he stood, swaying slightly before falling backwards. Naruto and Itachi caught him quickly and gently lowered him to the mud-covered ground before removing his mask. It was fleeting, but both saw his Sharingan shift back from its strange pattern to the normal Tritomo design. As Shisui lost consciousness, both his friends shared an uneasy look between them. Later on, after the trio passed back into the safety of their own borders with Shisui and Naruto carrying an unconscious Shisui and the dead body of the captive they had been sent to retrieve, they made camp in a small out-of-the-way clearing. After they got a fire going and had some food, the two sat around the flickering flames in silence. Shisui lay off to one side with a blanket thrown over him for warmth while the body of the former prisoner was sealed into the large scroll Naruto had brought. "Taka, what do you?" The stoic Uchiha raised a hand to motion for Naruto to be quiet. The raven-haired boy continued to stare into the dancing flames, the light reflecting off his Sharingan as they rotated lazily. "I don't know, Tora, I've never seen anything like it before." He sighed heavily before sitting back, using his forearms to prop up his body against the damp ground. "He wouldn't keep this from us, right?" Itachi shook his head slowly. It was really unlike Shisui to keep secrets from them, of any kind. It was an unspoken bond of trust between the three friends. They told each other everything. Naruto had already revealed he was the Jinchuriki of the Nine Tails. At first he was met with silence before Shisui managed to crack a joke about Naruto's stamina suddenly making sense. "No, I'm sure he doesn't know any more about this than we do." Even though he sounded confident, inside he was pondering those words with unease. But what about that thing? He just looked at the guy and it was like he was controlling him. Itachi sighed as he leaned back forwards, this time propping an arm on his knee. "I really don't know, but..." He trailed off as he stared into the flames, unsure of how to proceed. While it was true they didn't keep secrets, what he was about to say was something dangerous to the clan. But what? Itachi looked around, gazing at Naruto softly behind his mask before returning his gaze to the flames. "I think it was the Mangekyo Sharingan." Naruto blinked owlishly at his friend before his gaze drifted to Shisui's unconscious body. "The what?" Itachi shrugged slowly, never tearing his gaze away from the fire, captivated by the randomly dancing wisps of orange. "I don't know all the details. It's a legend even among the Uchiha clan, but it's said to be a stage above even the fully evolved Sharingan, only unlocked by Madara Uchiha himself. Nobody alive today even knows what it does, but beyond that, what he did, I have no idea." Naruto sighed as he looked at his friend's body again. "I don't know how we're going to explain this to the Hokage, or Lord Danzo." Itachi's gaze steeled for a moment as he finally looked away from the fire and towards his red-headed friend. "We tell them everything, that is our duty." Naruto glanced around in shock, only hidden thanks to his mask. "But if word gets out that Shisui has that kind of power..." He wasn't allowed to finish as Itachi cut him off again. "We are Umbu, tools of the village, and it is our duty to report everything to our superior and the Hokage." Naruto sighed as he looked up at the sky, noting how out here on the outskirts of the country the stars shined more clearly. "Right." He spared one last worried look at his friend before getting up to grab his sleeping bag. He had a feeling it would be a long night. It turned out that Naruto's fears seemed unfounded. By the time they returned to the village, Shisui was awake and had confirmed he had no idea what happened. One moment he was stressing over what to do and couldn't decide, and the next a word just seemed to appear in his mind. Apparently he seemed to leave his body and found himself looking through the eyes of the enemy captain. While he couldn't control the man directly, he just thought about not wanting his friends to be hurt, and the man just acted on his own. When they gave their mission report to the Hokage, he was saddened by the loss of one of the shinobi of his village. However, he couldn't risk a war with Iwa. Both countries weren't exactly strong at the moment. Iwa after losing the Third Shinobi War and Konoha due to the Kyubi attack. He was willing to look past it considering Naruto and Itachi had taken out two of the assailants, and while Hiruzen generally wasn't a fan of the eye for an eye way of thinking, it was what was best for the village. When they finally got onto the end of the fight and Shisui's abilities, the aged Hokage seemed incredibly interested by the apparent new ability the young Uchiha possessed. However, no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't demonstrate it. He couldn't even activate his Mangekyo willingly, he just didn't know how. In the end, the Hokage simply told him that if that ever changed, he was to inform him immediately, as such an ability should be analyzed if possible. Even so, being part of the Sharingan, the Uchiha would find a way to make sure such a rare and powerful ability would not become common knowledge and avoid it being studied if possible. Currently Naruto was wandering through the village in his civilian clothes, an orange sleeveless hoodie with a navy t-shirt underneath and beige cargo shorts. He was mulling over what Itachi told him back in that clearing, about the village being more important than their own feelings, at least that was what Naruto took from it. For some reason he particularly disliked the idea that Umbu, or even shinobi for that matter, were simply tools for the village. While he would gladly die for his home and its people, that wasn't because he was some disposable weapon. He would do such a thing to protect the people he cared about because he never wanted to see his friends like Itachi, Shisui or Enko get hurt. He continued to think about it as he walked rather aimlessly through packed streets, never noticing as he turned off into a quieter district, almost walking straight into somebody in the process. Oh, sorry about that. He looked up sheepishly only to blink for a moment as he saw a familiar shock of silver hair that he just couldn't quite place. Oh, that's no problem, Tora. Instantly Naruto was holding a kunai out in front of him as he dropped into a fighting stance on reflex. How do you know my code name? The tall man simply laughed jovially and waved a hand dismissively, which allowed the redhead a chance to take him in properly. He wore a mask covering most of his face while his headband was pulled over one eye, only revealing one which looked at him rather lazily. Now, Tora, I'm surprised you don't recognize me after all this time. Naruto blinked again, noting that the voice sounded incredibly familiar as he lowered the kunai. Taijo. The man just raised a hand and made a quick peace sign with what Naruto could only describe as an eye smile. Yo. Naruto completely put his kunai away, now confident that this man was in fact his captain. You can call me Kakashi Hatake if you want. Naruto just blinked, very confused at the moment at his captain's actions. Taijo, it is incredibly irregular to reveal your identity, even to comrades. Kakashi merely smiled again and gave another dismissive wave. Maybe. But it won't matter for very long. I'm retiring from Umbu. If Naruto was surprised he didn't show it, after nearly 7 years in Umbu and 4 of those as a captain, he would have been more surprised if he hadn't retired sometime soon. That's sad to hear, Taijo. It was a privilege working with you and I hope our next captain is as competent and skilled. Naruto couldn't completely tell due to the mask, but he could feel that Kakashi was grinning at him almost too happily. I'm so very glad you said that, Naruto. Once again Naruto wasn't surprised. While knowing his codename would be unusual, his identity out of the mask and uniform wasn't exactly a secret. I was actually looking for you. Naruto raised a solitary eyebrow for a moment, regarding his, now former, captain with intrigue. Oh? Why? Kakashi beamed again, although the only outward sign was his eye curling up again in that strange way. You know I am your father's former student, right? Although he didn't like to dwell on that, he nodded curtly. Yes. Kakashi nodded with a small melancholic smile. Did he mention anything about me? Naruto thought back hard to the years before. It's hard to recall. I guess he did a few times. Again Kakashi merely gave a small nod of understanding. And what did he say? You can't remember. Naruto gave a small shake of his head. I'm afraid I can't. Kakashi had a faraway look for a moment. Well, you've done your parents proud. He had the courtesy to blush slightly at that. Thanks, Taijo. Kakashi, please. Naruto gave him a somewhat reluctant nod. All right, Kakashi-san. He gave a more pleased nod with another of his seemingly trademark eye smiles. You've done them proud. You're an excellent shinobi. With lots of room to grow, but still, excellent. For your age, there are few that are your peer. Itachi and Shisui. Naruto supplied, not liking the breach in Umbu policy, but feeling like his captain had something very important to explain. Maybe some others, I don't know about. Yes. Both of your friends are unusually skilled for their age. It's tempting to think you are all time travelers from the future. Naruto's brows rose high at that. What? The man simply laughed dismissively. Oh, nothing. Just, well, you're too young. Newest Icha came out. Anyway, my point is, you are skilled, and not just in combat. tactics, planning, strategy. You are balanced, multifaceted. You don't have many apparent weaknesses. All good traits. You also work well with just about anybody and you know how to think on your feet. Thank you again, Kakashi-san. But I don't follow. You will my replacement. His perfectly serene smile never broke as he said it, and true to his Umbu training, Naruto didn't even raise a brow. What? Why me? It was a perfectly valid question. In Naruto's opinion, there were a few people who might deserve the position over him, those with more experience and probably ability too. Because I decided it should be you. People look up to you and respect your decisions. You have no qualms ordering people but still take others' opinions into consideration, and you have the power to protect your comrades. That time Naruto did blink. It was like he read it off a script. You certainly thought it through. Kakashi just smiled again, already looking like he was ready to take off, though I'm not convinced. It wasn't a decision I could make lightly. Naruto nodded at that. It was a position that took a great deal of responsibility and authority, just below the Jonin commander. What about Itachi? Kakashi nodded for a moment, apparently in thought, although from what Naruto had gathered on his personality so far he may have simply been bored. I considered him, as well as many others who have many more years' experience than you. He turned back to Naruto, the wandering and lazy gaze gone, replaced by a look of a man used to carrying the weight of command. But you have to trust that I have made the correct decision. If you start second-guessing yourself now, then maybe I didn't. Naruto met his gaze evenly for a moment before nodding curtly once. Let's just say, you're like a certain someone I know. I know that you will succeed. All right. And as if he had thrown a switch, the other, lazier, and carefree Kakashi was back with his ice smile and everything. Good, it'll be official in a few days. See ya, Naruto. He quickly vanished in a puff of smoke, leaving a contemplative Naruto in his wake. Well, that was strange. He shrugged it off and carried on walking. He would find out what Anko thought about all this. It was her opinion that he actually cared about, his own just wasn't enough. Despite all Kakashi's praise, he wasn't entirely convinced. He needed to get her perspective, the only other person who might be able to settle his doubts. Chapter 12, New Wounds. Naruto jogged casually through the streets, the late night air cool on his exposed arms. Normally he didn't run through the village so openly in his Umbu armor, but it was a nice night and there weren't many people about. Those that did see him simply paid him no mind, treating him as the silent and invisible protector that Umbu were supposed to be. In turn he ignored them, maintaining his official non-existence to the general public. It wasn't a foolproof charade. Anybody that knew him even reasonably well would be able to recognize him from his hair, mask, or no. He looked up briefly, watching the bright full moon as he jumped across rooftops on his way towards the outskirts of the village. He wasn't sure why Shisui had asked him to meet him by an old training ground, but the whole situation put him on edge slightly. His friend was never this secretive and the message was sent in the standard Umbu code. That alone was grounds to worry. That anxiety only increased as he dropped into the training ground to see Shisui standing by a fast-moving river, his back facing the redhead. Shisui. The black-haired Uchiha perked up a little as he heard his friend's voice ring out clearly in the still night. The dull roar of the waters in the river provided a constant background noise that mixed in with the other miscellaneous sounds of the forest. Hey Naruto. The Namikaze easily heard the slight strain in his friend's voice. It came out weak and lacked all the usual confidence. It's a nice night tonight, isn't it? Naruto wasn't sure what to make of this. His friend was acting strange and he had no idea what was going on. Shisui, what is it? What's going on? His friend merely held up a hand, holding it there as he cocked his head to the side like a dog listening out for something. Only a few moments later there was another rustle as Itachi dropped into the clearing, like Naruto fully decked out in his Umbu gear. Naruto couldn't tell explicitly due to his mask, but the other Uchiha seemed just as clueless as he was. Shisui, Naruto, what's this about? Naruto merely shrugged while Shisui continued to stare thoughtfully into the river, not turning around to his two friends. It's such a nice night. His sigh was audible, even above the harsh sounds of the water rushing along in the river. Naruto was seriously worried by now. This whole thing was so out of character for Shisui it had his nerves on edge. Shisui, what's going on, why are you like this? Their friend sighed again as he finally turned around, painfully slowly. To their credit as neither Itachi nor Naruto gasped or showed any outward reaction as they saw Shisui's face. Blood streamed down from his left eye leaving a slow-moving river down his cheek, the moonlight only serving to show more contrast between his pale cheek and the dark stream of crimson. Shisui, what happened? To Naruto's shock it was Itachi who spoke, his voice carrying far more emotion than he normally allowed people to hear, even in the company of his friends. For the third time that night Shisui sighed sadly, his expression somber and melancholic. I don't have a lot of time. I was able to lead them on a false trail long enough to get you messages, but I probably only have about 5 minutes. His weak voice was only met by uncomprehending silence from his friends, only broken by the occasional bird call or that ever-present roar of the river. I'm sorry guys. He offered a lame smile that only turned to a pained wince as he gently held a hand to his bleeding eye. I guess I just wasn't enough this time. Finally the silence and the tension got to Naruto and the catch in his throat holding him back from speaking disappeared. Shisui, what are you talking about? What happened to your eye? The attempt at a smile finally vanished from the Uchiha's face as he took on a more sobering expression, trying and failing to look at both his friends with his one good eye. I don't know who it was, but they wore uniforms, except they didn't. It was like some kind of twisted version, their masks looked more like demons than animals. But I do know they were from Konoha, they used our sign language. He winced again as he clutched a hand to his eye, the pain obviously tremendous even though he kept it hidden commendably. They were coming after my eyes, I got as much from their commands and the way they attacked me. They managed to pin me down in the compound and they got one of them, but I used a flash bomb and managed to get away. That alone was a sobering thought for all three of them. Your Mangekyo. Itachi's voice was quiet and contemplative but still loud enough that his friends heard him. Yeah, I figured as much as well. Again they lapsed into a brief silence, thinking about the consequences of what happened tonight. But that means... Shisui cut Naruto off with a raised hand, motioning for him to stop. I know, the only people who know about it are the Hokage, the clan and our superiors in Umbu. Itachi's brow furrowed deeply behind his mask, his eyes scanning back and forth rapidly as he thought. No, they wouldn't do this, it makes no sense, why would they hurt one of our own? Shisui sighed as his face contorted into a brief scowl, his pointed gaze directed solely at his cousin. Itachi, you know as well as I do that right now the Uchiha clan are under just as much suspicion as anybody else. At that Naruto looked up from thought quizzically, a questioning gaze turned at his two friends. What do you mean? Why would your family do something like this? Shisui looked at Naruto with as kind an expression as he could manage before sadly looking away, his gaze drifting to the river. We don't have that much time, I'm sorry Naruto. His gaze came back up, a slightly pained expression clear across his features, but it wasn't from his injury. My power is far too dangerous in the wrong hands and they already have one eye. At least that means it will be greatly weakened, but it is still too dangerous for me to stay in Konoha. Naruto blinked in surprise at the implications of Shisui's words. You're leaving? Becoming a missing nin. Shisui shook his head sadly, the regret obvious in his eye. No, I would have nowhere to go, not to mention I would be no safer. Wherever I run, wherever I hide, as long as I have these accursed eyes then I am in danger and a danger to everybody. Naruto could only look on helplessly, the words refusing to form for a moment. Then what? We can protect you. Shisui chuckled humorlessly, the action once again causing him to wince in obvious pain. Naruto, you can't protect me all the time, you are strong, but human. Even you have to sleep, eat, and move on with your life. By now tears were beginning to form in the redhead's eyes as he stared at his friend. Then we go with you. Shisui smiled, Naruto had never seen a more saddening sight than his best friend's heartbreaking smile. Where I'm going I hope you two will not have to follow for a long time. Before Naruto could ask what his friend meant he slowly unsheathed the tanto from his back with another heart-wrenching smile. You two will always be my closest friends, remember that please. And without another word Shisui drove the blade into his heart, his face eternally locked into a small smile as his body dropped lifelessly into the river, easily carried away by the strong currents. Shisui. Both Naruto and Itachi cried out together, already sprinting forward to the river. However, it was too late. Even if they could catch up to their friend's body, the strong currents had already pulled his body under, lost to their eyes. They could only watch helplessly from the riverbank, staring into the dark waters that perfectly reflected the many shining stars in the night sky. Naruto dropped to his knees, the whole situation finally catching up to him as he began to take ragged breaths between gasps. Itachi remained standing, his body rigid and frozen even as twin trails of blood slowly leaked from his eyes. The sound of a fist knocking on wood rang out clearly and loudly through the homely two-story house. Anko quickly vaulted the rest of the stairs she had been walking down to quickly run to the door, opening it with a small exasperated sigh as whoever it was kept knocking. She looked out in surprise at the two very gruff-looking Uchiha men standing in their front porch. One in particular seemed incredibly irritated. She knew they were Uchiha from the crests on their collars, although the Sharingan spinning lazily in their eyes was also a dead giveaway. Hello. The older-looking man of the two with silver hair and a distinctively arrogant look plastered over his face simply gazed at her disinterestedly. Naruto Namikaze lives here, correct? Anko frowned at his tone, it seemed, for lack of a better word, accusatory, and that didn't stand well with her. Who are you? The man sneered for a moment, obviously irritated he had to deal with a situation like this before grunting in annoyance. We're with the Konoha military police force to question Naruto Namikaze over Shisui Uchiha's suicide. The news hit Anko like a ton of bricks, making her gulp in surprise and shock, her eyes suddenly finding the floor as she blinked, her brow furrowed in pain and shock. She managed to just about look back up at the man who seemed nonplussed by the emotional display, not caring less about her reaction to the news he had so emotionlessly conveyed. Suicide. The man merely grunted in the affirmative, his irritated mask not budging for a second. Is Naruto Namikaze here or not? Anko was still stunned, but she did at least manage to nod at the question. What do you need with Naruto? She meant for the question to come out assertively, however her voice was quiet and subdued. She could only imagine how Naruto would take the news. Shisui had been his best friend, other than her. He had been strangely quiet and pensive recently as well. This wouldn't help things at all. None of your concern, our questions are for the Namikaze, not you. Even in her now emotionally fragile state, Anko gave the man a seething gaze, only saved from a scolding as Naruto suddenly made his appearance. Hey Anko, who's at the door? At his voice both Anko and the two Uchiha perked up, looking around as he jogged into the room, his hair still wet from a shower. Naruto Namikaze. The redhead eyed the two men critically but nodded all the same. He took note of their Uchiha crests and the shell-shocked look on Anko's face and instantly knew why they were here. Cursing softly in his head, he put on an air of total ignorance before joining Anko by her side. He knew this was coming, he hoped it wouldn't, but he was no idealist. After much debate, both he and Itachi agreed to keep what they knew about Shisui secret, respecting their friend's last unspoken wish. What's going on, Uchiha-san? The silvery-haired man sneered at the polite greeting, looking down his nose at the young Namikaze and sniffing loudly. We need to ask you some questions. Becoming slightly more serious at the tone, Naruto nodded warily before offering a hand for the two Uchiha to enter. Of course. They brushed past him quickly, both obviously wanting to get this over with soon. As they followed, Naruto sent a small glance Anko's way. The girl couldn't even look him in the eyes. After around a half hour of surprisingly intensive and all too accusatory questions, the Uchiha pair left, disgruntled and unenlightened. Naruto had kept the majority of his answers vague but reasonable, sticking to the truth where possible. He found it surprising how easy it was to lie to the two, although their general attitudes helped. All throughout the dreadful conversation, although interrogation may have been a more accurate description, Naruto had managed to put on a suitably shocked and disbelieving air. In truth, though, that was no problem. He was still in real shock over his friend's sudden suicide, and he had been bottling those emotions up since then. Wow. Naruto sat out his couch, staring up at the ceiling, the occasional blink the only sign he was even alive. Anko sat down next to him, naturally snuggling closer to his warm body even as she gazed at him worryingly. It pained her to see Naruto this way, so obviously devastated yet withdrawn and quiet. She couldn't even tell what he was thinking to even begin to try and help him. Instead, she pulled his loose hand into her own, holding onto it tightly, as much for her own benefit as it was for his. How are you doing? Naruto blinked a few times before taking a deep breath and turning to look at his oldest friend mechanically. Tears almost welled up in his eyes. Lying to the Uchiha had been one thing, but with Anko it was completely different. He wasn't been sure what he could tell her, or if it would be safe to tell her anything. He would have to talk with Itachi about it for later. For now he would simply have to maintain the act, although the edges of what was real and what was acting had already begun to blur. I'm not sure, it's just, everything. Anko nodded sadly, suddenly pulling herself forward to rest her head in the shoulder of Naruto closest to her. I know, I just can't believe it, I mean. It was Shisui. Her voice held genuine disbelief behind the more noticeable sadness and shock. He just always seemed so happy. Her voice became small with that and she unconsciously buried herself further into Naruto's shoulder. It made her wonder if there was something she had missed, some hidden sign that Shisui wasn't as alright as he looked, something she could have done to help. Worriedly she looked back up at Naruto's pensive face, knowing that no matter how bad she felt, Naruto could only be worse. What are we going to do now? Naruto broke away from whatever speck on the ceiling he had been so intently staring at to look down at her sadly. I don't know. He sighed with genuine regret and sorrow as he shifted on the couch to bring Anko closer to him. Right now he appreciated the comfort. Just keep living, I guess. It sounded optimistic, but his voice carried deep undertones of depression. Anko looked up, swearing she saw something in Naruto break at that moment, being replaced by something much darker and colder. It nearly made her shudder. Yeah. Both their gazes drifted over to a small standing picture frame on a nearby cabinet. The three smiling faces of a much younger Naruto, Itachi and Shisui, as well as the more neutral face of their sensei above them, shone back. Things had changed so much since those more innocent days. Naruto just wasn't sure how much more he could take. It was a quiet night and Naruto appreciated that. He liked that all he could hear was the wind rushing past his masked face and the occasional chirp of cicadas. Ever since Shisui died a week ago, his life had been one big blur of sympathizers and pity. He hated it. If anything, the mission he had suddenly been pulled away on was a blessing, although he didn't enjoy being away from Anko when she was so fragile. The girl had never really had people she could care for or who cared for her before meeting Naruto, and one of the most precious to her, her sensei, had betrayed her horribly. To see another of those people leave her so suddenly had taken its toll. In the same way, Itachi had become very withdrawn of late, never leaving the Uchiha compound except to train or for missions. In fact, Naruto hadn't spoken with him since that night. It was one of the reasons he was now gently roof-hopping through the still night air in the direction of the Uchiha compound. He had gotten back from his mission early and decided to go see his friend. They needed to talk and he had been putting it off for too long now. The mission was only an excuse. He ducked down into the streets, frowning when he saw the gate to the Uchiha compound at the end of the walkway. It definitely was not supposed to be open like that. Hurrying forward, he openly gasped as he saw what lay within. Blood was randomly spattered on the walls, kunai and shuriken littering the streets. Even with all his experience in Umbu, he was forced to support himself on a nearby wall. Even the civilians hadn't been spared. Itachi. Realizing his friend might be in danger, he took off in the direction of the clan head's house. He would find out what happened here when he knew his friend was safe. Rushing through the blood-drenched streets, he constantly had to fight off the urge to gag. The smell was sickening and the sights around him more so. He finally steeled himself as he vaulted the small wall around his friend's house, crashing through the door only to see something he never thought he would see. Itachi. His friend stood there, turning at the familiar and unwelcome voice, the fresh blood of his father still dripping slowly down the gleaming blade of his tanto. Naruto. Itachi seemed genuinely shocked by his friend's arrival, his hand trembling where it gripped the blade. Itachi? What's going on? The Uchiha never got to answer as a high-pitched gasp was heard behind them. All three members of the room spanned to see the trembling and wide-eyed form of one Sasuke Uchiha, his eyes locked on the unmoving form of his late father, before they drifted up to Itachi's emotionless face. Nina-san. Again Itachi was cut off as a panicked and desperate voice cried out, piercing the silent house. No. Run, Sasuke. Please just run. It was Mikoto who cried out. She had been about to receive the killing blow from her son when Naruto crashed through the door. Sasuke's breaths came in small, Startled gasps and his legs quaked uncontrollably, unable to move. Suddenly a switch flicked in his mind as he suddenly turned around, running out the door and back into the death-ridden streets. Naruto was still so shocked by all this he almost missed the black blur of Itachi's form racing past him in pursuit of his brother. Pulled out of his indecisiveness, he spared one glance at Mikoto to make sure she was okay before pelting after the two brothers. He caught up just as Sasuke dropped to the ground in the street, his pupils dilated and his body trembling in fear and pain. Bright red eyes with single tomo circling the pupil could be seen before his eyes closed and he fell into fitful unconsciousness. Ignoring the boy for now, Naruto focused on Itachi, who calmly turned to look at him, their eyes meeting. "Naruto." The redhead just didn't know what to say. "What do you say in a situation like this?" "No." His voice was a hoarse whisper and his legs threatened to give out from under him. "Please no." Itachi gave no sign he had heard the softly spoke please. "I can't lose you too." At that Itachi finally gave some sign that he had heard, taking a small step forward toward his friend. "Naruto dash." "Why?" He was cut off harshly as Naruto also took a step forward, tears of rage and betrayal falling unseen behind his mask. "After everything. After Shisui. What is this?" Naruto had no idea what kind of strain this put of Itachi. Even now his forced emotionless facade was cracking, shattering under his friend's betrayal-filled words. "I did what I had to, this was the only way." His voice was small, quiet, and unsure, like he didn't truly believe them himself. In his rage and anger though, Naruto took no notice, only clenching his fists until his knuckles turned an unnatural white. You. He trembled in confusion and rage, unable to convey what he wanted to, not even sure what he wanted to say in the first place. "Naruto, I dash." Itachi never got the chance to finish his sentence as Naruto's head suddenly snapped up, his gaze murderous. This was only accentuated by the blood-red eyes peering at him from behind equally red hair. Naruto was always good at controlling his emotions, especially anger and rage, but at that moment every defense he had was down. There was nothing between him and the burning force of energy sealed within him. "You bastard!" Itachi grunted in incredible pain as he looked down, his Sharingan eyes peering down at the fist forcefully punching his stomach. Naruto had simply been in one place one moment and standing in front of him the next. He didn't even get a chance to dwell on this before another lightning-fast punch was careening for his exposed face. Not one to be taken by surprise, twice Itachi leaned back past the blow, letting it swing over his head before moving to the side as Naruto viciously brought it down. It was obvious that Naruto wasn't in a sound state of mind at that moment, and as Itachi dodged backwards to escape another volley of blows he could only stare at his friend sadly. He had planned on Naruto being out of the village tonight. He couldn't have known Naruto would finish his mission early. He didn't want to fight his friend, not like this, not when Naruto wasn't even thinking clearly. He began to weave an intricate jutsu he hoped would give him enough time to get away, but Naruto's eye merely twitched in response before his face split into a vicious grin. "I won't be fooled by your silly mind games, you traitorous Uchiha." Even though he knew the words were not Naruto's own, Itachi couldn't help but feel the knife-like pain at his exclamation. "Naruto, this is not you but the fox." His only response was a snarl as the redhead dropped down onto all fours, using the extra traction from his hands to launch himself forward with even greater speed. This time Itachi had no chance to avoid the vicious rain of blows falling down across his body. His body armor took the majority of the damage, but he would still have painful bruises to show for it. Itachi tried to shunshin to get away, but Naruto was easily able to catch up to him, batting the normally stoic Uchiha out of the sky with an almost clawed hand. There were no visible signs of the fox's influence save for his eyes, but Itachi knew that as his anger grew then he would begin to draw upon more of the tainted chakra. Using what little maneuverability he had in the air, Itachi swung round, catching Naruto's arm with a free hand before pulling their bodies closer together so their eyes were level. Tsukuyomi. Instantly the colors in the world seemed to invert, a red sky taking the place of the darkness and the moon turning a foreboding black. Instead of the air, Naruto found himself on solid ground again, in a place he did not recognize. A field of black ground spread out in every direction seemingly infinitely as equally dark clouds passed overhead. He blinked, the world suddenly having more clarity now he was out of the influence of the malevolent chakra. "Naruto." He span on the spot, looking his friend in the face with cautious but still angry eyes, noting that he also had this strange color inversion. "Itachi, what's going on? What is this place?" Itachi sighed solemnly before he began to walk around Naruto, his hands placed behind his back in what he hoped was a non-threatening gesture. Even if Naruto had wanted to attack, he couldn't. It was like there was something holding his feet firmly on the ground. "This is my Tsukuyomi, one of my Mangekyo techniques." Naruto blinked at that but said nothing, letting Itachi continue with his explanation. "It is the ultimate genjutsu of the Sharingan. Here I am master of this world, even time is dilated, hours in here are mere seconds in reality." Naruto narrowed his eyes, subtly trying to move his feet only to find his legs once again unresponsive. "Why did you bring me here? To kill me like you did your clan?" He may not have been able to move his legs, but his hands were perfectly free to ball up into tight fists. "And how dare you wear that Umbu uniform to do it?" Itachi found himself fighting a losing battle with emotions. How desperately he wanted to explain, to justify his actions to his one and only true friend left in the world. To know the life that awaited him when he left the village, one of loneliness, he was frightened about extinguishing this last tenuous connection he had. "Naruto, there is so much I wish I could explain, instead I merely ask you to look after Sasuke." He began to walk away from his red-headed friend, his form slowly becoming fainter and fainter as he walked. "And Naruto?" He paused momentarily, almost looking back to where his friend stood rooted to the ground, but he couldn't quite bring himself to do it. "Thank you, for everything." And like that he was gone. Naruto was left alone in this dark, bleak world of dismal colors. Itachi looked down at the unconscious body of his last friend, unsure if he was even worthy of calling the redhead that after everything he had put him through. While he had done nothing to the Namikaze and the Tsukuyomi, almost 50 hours of information suddenly reaching the brain in a span of a few seconds was enough to knock anybody out. He sighed wearily, looking out over the place he had called his home his entire life, a single solitary tear leaking down his face before he steeled himself. If anybody had looked up that night, they would have seen a large flock of crows racing through the sky out of the village. Sasuke stared at the picture in his hands. It was an old one, taken when he was 5. He was in the foreground, smiling happily as he was held in his mother's warm and strong embrace from behind. To her right his father stood more solemnly, his regal air that he always held even radiating from his static visage. To Sasuke's left Itachi stood, almost a mirror of his father in his calm and proper demeanor, however his features held none of the same arrogance. It was taken the day Itachi became an Umbu, a day Sasuke remembered well because his brother had offered to train him in Shuriken Jutsu for the very first time. Sasuke only realized he was crying when a single tear dropped onto the picture before rolling lazily down the glass, leaving a small streak in its wake. He sniffed them back before more could join it, carefully rubbing his eyes. They had been itching strangely ever since that night. Sasuke suddenly shook his head to rid himself of the horrible images that swarmed his thoughts after that. However, nothing he did could erase those memories. Seeing the people he knew and had walked past every day lying in pools of their own blood would be etched into his memory forever. Why-na-san. He was forcefully pulled out of his memories and plight as a gentle knock reverberated on his door before an equally gentle voice accompanied it. "Sasuke-kun, you should get some sleep." The young Uchiha sighed. His mother sounded so tired, he knew she was just as hurt and confused as he was. "All right, Ka-san." His voice was a strained whisper, but it seemed to satisfy his concerned mother as he heard her footsteps slowly retreat from his room. With a weary sigh he replaced the picture frame on a dresser before moving over to the window to close the blinds. However, before he did, a light caught his eye from somewhere in the compound. Sasuke knew there shouldn't be any lights on anywhere in the Uchiha district. Worried that they might have intruders, Sasuke opened up the window quietly before dropping out. He rushed through the streets as fast as his small legs would carry him, having to glance away at places he vividly remembered dead bodies of fellow Uchiha lying. The blood stains had been cleaned away quickly after the so-called incident, but Sasuke could remember them all like they were burned into his memory. Rounding the corner where he saw the light, Sasuke was surprised to find it was the house of one of his brother's old friends. Shisui would sometimes come over to their house for dinner. Cautiously and nervously he crept further in, walking around the house to the backyard where the light was casting eerie shadows. Finally he entered the garden only to see a single person standing in the middle of the garden, staring at a makeshift ring that looked like it was designed to hold spars in. Sasuke couldn't tell because of the mask the man wore, but he could have sworn his whole body showed sadness and melancholy. Who are you? What are you doing here? The man looked around quickly, his masked face settling on Sasuke as before he suddenly vanished in nothing more than a blur of red. Sasuke blinked in surprise, wondering if it was all in his head. The man had vanished so suddenly it was like he was a ghost. With more questions than answers, Sasuke began the trip back to his own house, a small yawn escaping his lips and his brow furrowed into a confused expression. That's it for part 3. Thank you for watching and see you on the next video.